The Nazis accidentally invented something so revolutionary that we still use it every single day, yet nobody knows they created it. Tonight you'll discover this hidden invention along with 99 other forgotten WWII technologies that quietly shaped our modern world, while you drift peacefully to sleep. The war that changed everything wasn't just fought with guns and bombs. Hidden beneath the chaos of World War II, brilliant minds were cooking up inventions that would transform your daily life forever. And some of these breakthroughs happened by pure accident. Take penicillin, for instance. Alexander Fleming had already discovered this miracle drug in 1928, but nobody cared much about it until the war started killing millions. Suddenly every scratch, every wound, every infection became a death sentence on the battlefield. That's when scientists realized they had liquid gold sitting in their labs. By 1943, they were mass-producing penicillin, and it saved more lives than any weapon ever destroyed. Before this wonder drug, a simple cut could kill a soldier faster than enemy fire. Pretty crazy when you think about it, right? But here's where things get really interesting. While doctors were busy saving lives with penicillin, engineers were playing with invisible waves that could spot enemy planes miles away. Radar technology bounced radio signals off aircraft like throwing a ball against a wall and listening for the echo. Britain's radar stations could detect German bombers before they even crossed the English Channel. The Germans never figured out why the British always seemed ready for their surprise attacks. Well, surprise, it wasn't magic, just really smart science. Then there's the story of jet engines, which sounds like something from a science fiction movie. The Germans built the world's first jet fighter, the Me-262, and it was terrifyingly fast. Traditional propeller planes looked like bicycles racing against motorcycles. These jets could reach speeds that made pilots feel like they were riding lightning. The roar of jet engines changed warfare forever, and today, every time you board a commercial flight, you're riding technology that was born in the heat of battle. Let's not forget one of the most humble yet revolutionary inventions, the ballpoint pen. Sounds boring? Think again. Fountain pens were a pilot's nightmare at high altitudes because the ink would freeze or leak all over important maps and documents. Hungarian inventor László Bíró created a pen with thick, fast-drying ink that worked perfectly in freezing cockpits. The Royal Air Force ordered 30,000 of these pens during the war. That smooth-writing pen in your pocket today, it's a direct descendant of wartime ingenuity, and the weird part is how freeze-dried coffee became a secret weapon. Soldiers needed to stay alert during long, dangerous missions, but brewing fresh coffee in a foxhole wasn't exactly practical. Nestlé perfected instant coffee that could be mixed with cold water and still taste decent. Troops could get their caffeine fix without lighting fires that might give away their position to enemy snipers. Coffee literally helped win the war, one cup at a time. The fascinating thing about these wartime inventions is how they solved immediate life-or-death problems. Engineers weren't sitting around wondering what might be nice to have someday. They were racing against time, trying to save lives and win battles. This pressure cooker environment forced innovation at breakneck speed. Mistakes meant people died, so every invention had to work perfectly the first time. Take radar again. It wasn't just about spotting enemy planes. Ships used it to navigate in complete darkness without crashing into each other. Anti-aircraft guns used radar to aim at targets they couldn't even see. Weather forecasters discovered they could track storms with the same technology. What started as a military defense system became the backbone of modern air traffic control, weather prediction, and even the microwave oven in your kitchen. But these weren't the only electronic marvels brewing in secret laboratories. While radar was bouncing waves through the sky, other machines were crunching numbers and breaking codes in ways that seemed impossible. The Germans thought their secret messages were unbreakable, protected by machines that scrambled words into meaningless gibberish. They were wrong, and the story of how the Allies cracked these codes involves room-sized computers that could think faster than any human brain. These early computers didn't look anything like the sleek devices we use today. They were massive, noisy monsters filled with thousands of glowing tubes that generated enough heat to warm an entire building. Yet these mechanical brains could solve puzzles that would take human mathematicians years to crack. The race to build better, faster-thinking machines was just getting started, and the implications would stretch far beyond the battlefield. The most remarkable thing about all these innovations: most people had no idea they were being invented. Soldiers used penicillin without understanding how it worked. Pilots flew with ballpoint pens without knowing they were using cutting-edge technology. Radar operators watched green dots on screens. completely unaware they were operating equipment that would revolutionize civilian life decades later. Inside a secret facility called Bletchley Park, something extraordinary was happening. While most people were focused on tanks and bombs, a group of brilliant minds was building machines that would change everything. They called it Colossus, and it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. This wasn't your grandmother's calculator. Colossus stood as tall as a person and stretched across an entire room. Hundreds of glass tubes called electronic valves glowed like tiny light bulbs, replacing the slow mechanical switches that older machines relied on. The clicking and humming never stopped. Day and night, this electronic beast crunched through thousands of calculations faster than any human could dream of doing by hand. But here's the kicker. Calculators didn't even exist yet for regular people. While families were still using pencil and paper for basic math, these wartime computers were solving puzzles that would take teams of mathematicians months to figure out. The contrast was mind-blowing. Most folks had never seen anything more advanced than a typewriter, yet hidden away in British countryside buildings, machines were performing electronic magic. The Germans had their Enigma machine, churning out coded messages they thought were impossible to crack. Well, they were wrong. Colossus ate those codes for breakfast. Every intercepted German message got fed into this electronic monster, and out came readable English text revealing enemy plans, troop movements, and secret strategies. The code breakers working alongside these early computers could suddenly peek behind enemy lines without leaving their chairs. Then came ENIAC across the Atlantic. This American computer made Colossus look small. ENIAC weighed over 27 tons. Imagine trying to move that thing. You could park 3 cars inside the space it occupied, and it consumed enough electricity to power a small neighborhood. The engineers who built it had to literally walk inside the machine to change settings and fix problems. When ENIAC was thinking hard, the lights in nearby buildings would dim from the power drain. These massive machines didn't have screens or keyboards like computers today. Instead, operators plugged cables into different sockets and flipped hundreds of switches to program them. Making a single mistake meant starting over from scratch, and programming could take days. But when everything worked correctly, ENIAC could solve mathematical problems in minutes that would normally require weeks of human calculation. The impact went far beyond just breaking codes. These early computers helped calculate artillery trajectories, plan supply routes, and analyze weather patterns for military operations. Every major decision during the final years of the war had some connection to computer calculations happening in the background. And here's something that might surprise you. Historians estimate that these code-breaking computers shortened World War II by up to 2 years, 2 entire years. Think about how many lives that saved, how much destruction was prevented, all because a few brilliant engineers figured out how to make glass tubes and electrical circuits work together in completely new ways. The funny thing is, most of the world had no idea these machines existed. The work at places like Bletchley Park remained top secret for decades after the war ended. People were still impressed by electric toasters and radio shows, completely unaware that electronic brains had been solving the world's most complex problems right under their noses. These early computers faced constant breakdowns. Glass valves burned out regularly, requiring technicians to hunt through hundreds of tubes to find the dead ones. Sometimes moths would fly into the machinery and cause short circuits. That's actually where the term computer bug comes from. Real insects causing real problems in real computers. Despite all the technical headaches, the potential was obvious to anyone paying attention. These machines could process information at superhuman speeds and never got tired or made arithmetic errors. They worked around the clock without coffee breaks or sick days. The military applications were just the beginning. The engineers building these early computers often had to invent solutions as they went along. Nobody had written instruction manuals for electronic computation because nobody had ever done it before. They were literally making up the rules of computer science while fighting a world war at the same time. But while these room-sized electronic brains were impressive, they were still pretty limited. They could only tackle problems they were specifically designed to handle. Switching from code breaking to artillery calculations required major rewiring and reprogramming efforts that could take weeks. What nobody fully realized at the time was how these wartime experiments with electronic computation would eventually lead to something even more secretive and sophisticated. The same brilliant minds working on breaking enemy codes were already dreaming up new ways to hide their own messages from prying eyes. While everyone was busy building better guns and tanks, some of the war's most important battles were happening in complete silence. No explosions, no charging soldiers. Just brilliant minds trying to crack each other's secrets. The Germans thought they had created the perfect secret-keeping machine. They called it Enigma, and it looked like an oversized typewriter that had been attacked by Christmas lights. Every time you pressed a key, electrical circuits would spin through a maze of rotating wheels, scrambling your message into complete gibberish. The German High Command was so confident in this machine that they used it for everything from ordering lunch to planning major invasions. But here's where it gets interesting. The Enigma wasn't just one machine, it was thousands of them, all talking to each other in code. Each morning, German radio operators would receive new settings: which wheels to use, how to position them, which letters to swap around. With over 150 trillion possible combinations each day, the Germans figured it would take enemy codebreakers longer than the age of the universe to crack their messages. They were wrong, dead wrong. The Allies had something the Germans didn't expect: a Polish mathematician named Marian Rejewski, who had been quietly studying Enigma machines since the 1930s. When war broke out, the Poles handed their research to the British, who immediately set up shop at a place called Bletchley Park. This wasn't some high-tech military base, it was a Victorian mansion in the English countryside where brilliant misfits worked around the clock to read Hitler's mail. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park discovered something crucial about human nature. German operators, despite strict orders, kept making the same mistakes. Some would use their girlfriend's initials as settings, others picked patterns that seemed random but weren't. One operator famously used Hitler as his daily key setting for weeks. These tiny human errors gave the Allies their way in. Then there's the voice scrambling technology that sounds like something from a spy movie. Regular radio conversations were far too risky. Anyone with a radio could listen in. Military engineers developed devices that would chop up speech into tiny fragments, scramble the pieces like a jigsaw puzzle, then broadcast the mess over radio waves. The person on the other end had a matching device that would unscramble everything back into normal speech. These voice scramblers were crude by today's standards, but they worked well enough to fool most eavesdroppers. The downside: conversations sounded like they were happening inside a washing machine filled with robots. Pilots reported that using scrambled radios for more than a few minutes gave them splitting headaches. What made wartime encryption truly fascinating was the daily password system. Military units couldn't rely on complex machines for every single communication, so they developed cipher systems that changed every 24 hours. Code words ranged from mundane things like butterfly and teacup to inside jokes that only specific units would understand. American forces became particularly creative with their passwords. They'd often use words that were difficult for enemy soldiers to pronounce correctly. Japanese soldiers, for instance, struggled with English LMR sounds, so passwords like Alolopalooza became common in the Pacific Theater. German infiltrators had trouble with W sounds, making whiskey and wonderful popular choices in Europe. But the real genius wasn't in making codes harder to break, it was in breaking them faster than the enemy thought possible. The Allies developed specialized code-breaking devices that could process thousands of possible solutions in hours instead of years. These machines, working alongside the early computers we mentioned earlier, turned code-breaking from an art into a science. The psychological warfare aspect was equally important. Once the Allies could read German communications, they faced a terrible dilemma. How do you use secret intelligence without revealing that you have it? If Allied forces avoided every German trap perfectly, the enemy would realize their codes had been compromised. Military planners had to deliberately sacrifice some advantages to protect the bigger secret. Intelligence officers developed elaborate deception schemes. They'd send fake reconnaissance flights over areas they already knew about through intercepted messages. They'd stage phony intelligence operations to create plausible explanations for their knowledge. Sometimes they'd even allow small German operations to succeed, just to maintain the illusion that Enigma was still secure. This created one of warfare's strangest ironies. Having perfect information sometimes meant pretending you didn't have it. The encryption techniques developed during WWII didn't vanish when the fighting ended. Modern cybersecurity borrows heavily from wartime innovations. Those daily password changes, they evolved into today's two-factor authentication. Voice scrambling technology grew into the encrypted phone calls that protect government communications. Even the psychological tricks used to hide successful code-breaking influence how modern intelligence agencies operate. While secret communications were reshaping how wars were fought, military engineers were busy creating some of the strangest vehicles ever built for combat. Talking about code-breaking computers and secret messages is fascinating, but wait until you hear about the absolutely bizarre vehicles that rolled, floated, and crawled across battlefields during World War II. Engineers went completely wild designing machines that seem like they came straight out of a comic book. The Germans built something called the Maus tank that weighed 188 tons. That's heavier than a blue whale. This monster was so ridiculously oversized that it couldn't cross most bridges without crushing them into rubble. The thing moved at a whopping 8 miles per hour on a good day, which meant enemy soldiers could literally outrun it on foot. Only 2 prototypes were ever completed because, well, common sense eventually kicked in. But here's the kicker. Modern tank armor still uses some of the same steel layering techniques that made the Maus nearly indestructible. Then there's the American DUKW, nicknamed the Duck. This genius invention could drive down a road like a regular truck, then splash right into water and paddle around like a boat. No joke, soldiers would drive these things off landing craft, swim to shore, and keep driving up the beach without missing a beat. The Duck saved countless hours during D-Day landings because troops didn't need separate vehicles for land and water. Thousands of these amphibious trucks were built, and some are still giving tourist rides today. Japan took a completely different approach with their midget submarines. These tiny underwater vehicles were only 78 feet long and carried just 2 crew members plus a couple of torpedoes. The cramped conditions inside were absolutely miserable. Imagine being stuck in a metal tube the size of a school bus bathroom for hours. 5 of these mini-subs attacked Pearl Harbor, though none successfully returned home. Later versions could detach their front section as a manned torpedo, which tells you everything about how desperate the situation had become. But wait, it gets weirder. German engineers created wind-powered vehicles for crossing frozen terrain where fuel was scarce. Picture a truck with a giant sail attached to the roof, sliding across ice fields like some sort of military icebox on wheels. These contraptions actually worked pretty well in Scandinavia, where strong Arctic winds could push them along at decent speeds. The downside: try steering one of these things during a blizzard without ending up in a snowbank. Speaking of German engineering gone wild, they also experimented with rocket-powered vehicles. Not just planes, actual ground vehicles with rockets strapped to the back. Most of these exploded spectacularly during testing, but a few prototypes reached incredible speeds before inevitably crashing. The research wasn't completely worthless though, since it helped develop rocket technology that would later power space missions. Meanwhile, the British were busy creating their own mechanical monstrosities. The Panjandrum was essentially 2 giant wheels connected by a central drum with rockets attached around the edges to make the whole thing roll forward. The idea was to blast through German beach defenses by rolling this explosive wheel straight into enemy positions. During testing, the rockets fired randomly in all directions, sending the Panjandrum careening wildly across the beach while terrified officials dove for cover. Needless to say, it never saw combat. Let's not forget about bulletproof glass, which first appeared in military vehicles during this period. Early versions were incredibly thick and heavy, making vehicles slower but much safer for drivers and gunners. Tank crews could finally see where they were going without getting their heads blown off, which was definitely an improvement over previous wars. Some vehicles featured retractable armor plates that could extend for extra protection during firefights, then fold back for normal driving. This pop-up armor concept influences modern military vehicle design, where protection needs to balance against mobility and fuel efficiency. The strangest part might be how many of these bizarre wartime vehicles influenced civilian transportation decades later. 4-wheel drive systems, waterproof sealing techniques, and even basic SUV design concepts all trace back to military vehicles that seemed completely crazy at the time. That family minivan in your driveway shares DNA with amphibious assault vehicles that stormed enemy beaches. Vehicle designers during World War II threw every possible idea at the wall to see what stuck. Most didn't work, some worked too well, and a few accidentally changed civilian transportation forever. The engineers weren't just building machines, they were reimagining what vehicles could do when normal rules no longer applied. These mechanical experiments proved that desperate times really do spark incredible creativity, even if that creativity sometimes produces a 188-ton tank that can't cross bridges. While these strange war vehicles were solving immediate battlefield problems, they were also quietly developing materials and techniques that would revolutionize survival in completely different ways. When your country is at war, you can't always get what you need. Japan had control of most rubber plantations in Southeast Asia, leaving the Allies scrambling for alternatives. The answer? Make it yourself from scratch. Scientists working around the clock discovered synthetic rubber that could bounce, stretch, and grip roads just like the natural stuff. But here's the kicker, it sometimes worked even better. Synthetic rubber didn't crack in freezing temperatures like natural rubber did. Tank treads, truck tires, and even the rubber seals on aircraft engines suddenly became more reliable than ever before. The real game changer was nylon. Before the war, parachutes were made from silk. Makes sense, right? Silk was strong, lightweight, and had just enough give to slow a falling soldier safely. But silk came mostly from Japan and China, not exactly friendly suppliers during wartime. DuPont's nylon stepped in as the perfect replacement. Well, almost perfect. Early nylon parachutes had one tiny problem. They opened so fast they sometimes knocked pilots unconscious from the sudden jerk. Engineers quickly figured out how to add controlled stretch to the fabric. Problem solved, and now paratroopers could land conscious and ready to fight. Nylon didn't stop at parachutes. Ropes made from this synthetic wonder could hold more weight than traditional hemp ropes. They didn't rot in tropical humidity or freeze stiff in Arctic conditions. Climbing gear, tent guy lines, and even bootlaces got the nylon treatment. Soldiers could march farther, climb higher, and survive longer with gear that simply refused to break down. Then there's the story of plastic helmets that nobody talks about. Steel helmets were heavy and conducted cold like nobody's business. Touch your tongue to a steel helmet in winter, and you'd leave skin behind. Plastic alternatives weighed half as much and stayed comfortable in any weather. But the weird part is how they tested helmet strength. Engineers literally shot at plastic samples with different bullets to see what would stop and what would go straight through. The early plastic formulas that became Kevlar's ancestor could actually stop some low-velocity rounds. Not rifle bullets, mind you, but pistol rounds and shrapnel fragments bounced right off. Synthetic materials also revolutionized soldier mobility. Natural leather boots absorbed water like sponges and took forever to dry out. Soldiers marching through European mud or Pacific jungles often developed trench foot from constantly wet boots. Synthetic leather alternatives shed water and dried quickly. Suddenly armies could move faster and stay healthier in terrible conditions. Also, let's not forget synthetic fabrics for uniforms themselves. Cotton uniforms shrank, faded, and fell apart after a few washes. Wool stayed warm when wet but took ages to dry, and attracted every insect within miles. Synthetic blends combined the best features of both while eliminating most problems. They dried fast, kept their shape, and didn't smell as bad after weeks without proper washing facilities. The chemistry behind these materials reads like magic. Take a bunch of carbon, hydrogen, and other common elements, heat them up with the right catalysts and pressures. Out comes a material stronger than what nature spent millions of years perfecting. Scientists were essentially playing God with molecules, creating substances that had never existed on Earth, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. Traditional supply chains were cut, bombed, or occupied by enemies. Synthetic alternatives could be manufactured anywhere you could build a chemical plant. No more depending on rubber trees in Malaysia or silkworms in China. Raw materials came from coal, petroleum, and other resources. The Allies controlled. Production numbers tell the real story. By 1945, the United States was producing over 800,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. That's enough to make tires for millions of vehicles. Nylon production jumped from experimental batches to industrial scale in less than 3 years. When your survival depends on it, innovation happens fast. These synthetic materials didn't just help win the war, they changed civilian life forever. After 1945, synthetic fabrics became cheaper than natural ones. Nylon stockings replaced silk ones. Synthetic rubber tires lasted longer than natural rubber versions. Plastic everything started appearing in homes across America and Europe. The durability factor was incredible. Natural materials degraded, rotted, or got eaten by insects. Synthetic alternatives laughed at bacteria, ignored temperature swings, and stayed strong for decades. Soldiers could carry less weight and still have more reliable gear than previous generations. But here's what's really fascinating. Some of these wartime synthetic materials were actually superior to anything we use today. Modern plastics often prioritize being cheap over being indestructible. Wartime synthetics were engineered for life or death reliability. Cost be damned. The legacy lives on in every piece of synthetic clothing you wear, every plastic item you touch, and every synthetic rubber tire on the road. Materials science took a massive leap forward because armies needed stuff that simply worked better than anything nature provided. Speaking of things that worked better than nature provided, let's talk about engines that didn't need propellers at all. While most warplanes still relied on spinning propellers in 1944, Germany shocked the world with something completely different. The Messerschmitt Me 262 screamed across European skies without a single propeller blade. Instead, twin jet engines mounted under its swept wings pushed it forward at speeds that left Allied pilots stunned and confused. This wasn't just another airplane upgrade. The Me 262 represented a complete revolution in how machines could fly. Traditional aircraft engines turned propellers, which grabbed air and pushed it backward. Jet engines worked differently. They sucked in air, mixed it with fuel, ignited the mixture, and shot the burning gases out the back at incredible speed. The result? Pure thrust that could propel aircraft faster than anyone thought possible. German engineers had been secretly developing this technology since the late 1930s. Hans von Ohain, a young physicist, built the first working jet engine, while most people still considered flight itself a modern miracle. His engines used centrifugal compressors to squeeze air, then burned fuel in combustion chambers before blasting exhaust through turbines. Complex, absolutely. Revolutionary, even more so. The Me 262's first combat appearance left Allied pilots scratching their heads. Imagine chasing what you think is a normal enemy fighter, only to watch it suddenly accelerate away like a rocket. That's exactly what happened. The jet could reach nearly 540 miles per hour, almost double the speed of the fastest propeller fighters. Pilots reported seeing strange aircraft with no visible propellers, moving at impossible speeds. But Germany wasn't the only nation racing toward jet-powered flight. Britain had been developing its own secret weapon. The Gloucester Meteor, powered by Frank Whittle's revolutionary jet engines, took to British skies just months after the Me 262's debut. Whittle had actually conceived jet propulsion before the Germans, but bureaucratic delays and funding problems slowed his progress. War has a way of accelerating innovation though. Suddenly everyone wanted jet engines yesterday. The speed difference was mind-blowing. While the best propeller fighters topped out around 450 miles per hour in perfect conditions, these early jets routinely exceeded 500 miles per hour. They could climb faster, dive steeper, and outrun virtually anything else in the sky. Traditional dogfighting tactics became obsolete overnight. Pilots had to completely relearn aerial combat. Yet these early jets came with serious problems. They guzzled fuel like thirsty giants, limiting their range and flight time. The engines took forever to spool up, making quick takeoffs nearly impossible. Worse, they were incredibly fragile. Me 262 engines needed complete rebuilds after just 25 hours of operation. Compare that to reliable piston engines that ran for hundreds of hours between overhauls. The materials available during wartime created additional headaches. Germany lacked access to rare metals needed for turbine blades, forcing engineers to use inferior substitutes. Engines frequently suffered catastrophic failures, sometimes tearing themselves apart mid-flight. Pilots joked nervously that they were test pilots whether they wanted to be or not. Then there's the production timeline. Germany produced fewer than 1,400 Me 262s during the entire war, while they manufactured tens of thousands of conventional fighters. Jet engines required precision manufacturing techniques that war-torn factories struggled to maintain. Each engine contained thousands of precisely machined parts that had to work perfectly together. One small flaw could destroy the entire engine within minutes. Allied intelligence worked frantically to understand this new threat. Captured Me 262s were shipped to Britain and America for detailed analysis. Engineers reverse-engineered every component, trying to unlock the secrets of jet propulsion. The race wasn't just about winning the current war anymore. It was about controlling the future of aviation. Weather presented unexpected challenges too. Early jet engines were sensitive to temperature changes, altitude variations, and even humidity levels. Pilots learned to baby their engines, carefully managing throttle settings and avoiding sudden movements. The incredible speed came with a price: constant vigilance and technical expertise. Military strategists quickly realized jets would change everything. Air superiority, bombing campaigns, reconnaissance missions. Every aspect of aerial warfare would need updating. The raw speed advantage meant jets could intercept bombers that conventional fighters couldn't catch. They could also escape from dangerous situations by simply outrunning their pursuers. Manufacturing these revolutionary engines required entirely new industrial processes. Factories had to develop specialized welding techniques for turbine blades, create new testing equipment, and train workers in precision assembly methods. The learning curve was steep, expensive, and sometimes deadly when engines failed during testing. Looking back, those primitive wartime jets seem almost crude compared to modern aircraft, but they established principles that every airline passenger experiences today. The roar of jet engines during takeoff, the smooth acceleration at altitude, the ability to cross continents in hours rather than days, all trace their ancestry back to those desperate wartime innovations. The real breakthrough wasn't just about speed though. Jets could operate at much higher altitudes where the air was thinner and weather was less problematic. This altitude advantage would prove crucial for the next wave of military innovations, including some truly bizarre experimental weapons that pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible in warfare. While engineers worked on legitimate military equipment, some bright minds decided to go completely off the rails. The weapons that emerged from this creative chaos weren't just unusual, they were downright bizarre. Most never made it past testing, but their stories reveal just how desperate and innovative wartime thinking could get. Britain's panjandrum stands as perhaps the most ridiculous weapon ever conceived. Picture a giant wheel, 10 feet tall, packed with explosives and powered by rockets. The idea? Roll this monster toward enemy fortifications and watch it explode on contact. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, the reality was pure comedy. During beach tests, the panjandrum would start rolling in the right direction, then suddenly veer off course like a drunk shopping cart. Sometimes it chased the very engineers who built it. The rockets would fire unevenly, sending the wheel spinning in circles or bouncing into the air. One test nearly took out a group of VIP observers who had to dive for cover. The project was quickly abandoned, but not before providing endless entertainment for everyone involved. Then there's Germany's Krumloff, which translates to curved barrel. German engineers literally bent rifle barrels at 30-degree angles, allowing soldiers to shoot around corners without exposing themselves. The concept made sense for urban warfare and tank crews who needed to fire from cramped spaces, but physics had other plans. The bullets would tumble wildly after hitting the curve, making accuracy nearly impossible. Worse yet, the barrels wore out after just a few hundred shots because the metal couldn't handle the stress. Some versions had periscopes attached so shooters could aim around corners, making the whole contraption look like a plumber's nightmare. Despite its problems, small numbers were actually produced and used in combat, though their effectiveness remained questionable. Britain's Smith gun took a completely different approach to artillery. Instead of mounting cannons normally, this weapon lay on its side and fired horizontally. The 3-inch gun could supposedly take out tanks and fortifications, but its sideways design created serious problems. Loading was awkward, aiming was difficult, and the recoil would send the entire gun sliding across the ground. Crews had to constantly reposition after each shot, making rapid fire impossible. The Smith gun saw limited use in coastal defense, where its operators had plenty of time to set up and aim, but it never proved practical for mobile warfare. The White Rabbit trench digger represented Britain's attempt to mechanize battlefield engineering. This massive machine was designed to dig trenches and tunnels at incredible speed, theoretically allowing troops to advance under cover. The contraption looked like a mechanical mole on steroids, complete with rotating cutting heads and conveyor systems to remove dirt. Unfortunately, it was also enormous, slow, and made enough noise to alert enemies from miles away. The machine proved too complex to maintain in field conditions and too vulnerable to enemy fire. After a few disappointing tests, the White Rabbit was quietly shelved. American inventors weren't immune to wild ideas either. The Bat Bomb project involved attaching tiny incendiary devices to thousands of bats, then releasing them over Japanese cities. The theory was that bats would roost in wooden buildings and the delayed fuse bombs would start widespread fires. Testing began with high hopes, but the bats had their own agenda. Some flew back toward American bases, others died from the cold at high altitudes, and a few actually set fire to the testing facility. The project consumed significant resources before officials realized that conventional bombing was far more reliable. What's fascinating about these failed weapons isn't just their strangeness, it's what they reveal about wartime innovation. Engineers and inventors were under enormous pressure to create game-changing weapons quickly. Normal design processes were compressed, and ideas that would typically be rejected in peacetime received serious consideration. The line between brilliant and ridiculous became very thin when national survival was at stake. Many of these weird weapons actually contain seeds of future technology. The Krumlov's around the corner shooting concept lives on in modern military mirrors and camera systems that let soldiers observe dangerous areas safely. The Panjandrum's guidance problems highlighted issues that rocket scientists would later solve in missile development. Even the failed trench digger contributed to understanding about mechanical excavation that proved useful in post-war construction. Some weapons were simply ahead of their time. Ideas that seemed impossible in the 1940s became reality decades later with better materials and electronics. The creative thinking that produced these oddball weapons also generated practical innovations that changed warfare forever. But perhaps the most important lesson from these forgotten weapons is that innovation requires the freedom to fail spectacularly. The same environment that produced ridiculous rolling bombs also created radar, jet engines, and countless other breakthroughs that shaped the modern world. Speaking of practical innovations that actually worked, soldiers needed more than exotic weapons to survive. They needed reliable food that could last for months without spoiling. When soldiers went to war, they couldn't exactly pack a lunchbox and hope for the best. Armies needed to feed millions of people in places where grocery stores didn't exist, and restaurant delivery wasn't an option. The solution? Revolutionary field food that would change how we eat forever. K-rations became the backbone of military meals during WWII. These weren't your grandmother's home-cooked dinners. Each small box contained a complete meal designed by nutritionists who understood that hungry soldiers make poor fighters. The boxes were compact enough to fit in a backpack yet packed enough calories to keep a grown man marching for miles. Inside you'd find canned meat, crackers, chocolate, and even cigarettes, because apparently nicotine was considered essential back then. But here's where it gets interesting. The military didn't just throw some sandwiches in a bag and call it a day. They hired food scientists to create meals that could survive being dropped from planes, buried in mud, frozen solid, or baked in desert heat. These meals had to remain edible for months without refrigeration. Makes your complaints about airline food seem pretty silly, right? Tinned meat became a game changer for field nutrition. Before WWII, armies often struggled with feeding troops far from supply lines. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, especially in hot climates where temperatures could kill both soldiers and their dinner. The canning process solved this by creating shelf-stable protein that lasted for months. Sure, it didn't taste like mom's pot roast, but it kept millions of soldiers alive and fighting. The real breakthrough came with portion control and calorie density. Military nutritionists calculated exactly how many calories a soldier needed based on different activities. A guy sitting in a radio bunker needed fewer calories than someone marching 20 miles with full gear. This precision approach to nutrition was revolutionary for its time and laid the groundwork for modern dietary science. Then there's instant soup powder, which might sound boring until you realize what it represented. Taking fresh vegetables, meat, and seasonings, then turning them into a powder that could be reconstituted with hot water was like magic to soldiers in the field. No refrigeration needed, no heavy cans to carry, just add water, and boom, hot soup that reminded them of home. Well, sort of reminded them of home. Let's be honest here, these instant soups tasted more like salty water with ambitions than actual soup. But when you're cold, tired, and scared, even mediocre hot food becomes a small miracle. The psychological boost was often more important than the nutritional content. Chocolate bars deserve special mention because they served dual purposes as food and medicine. Military chocolate wasn't the sweet treat you'd buy at a candy store. It was formulated to melt in your mouth but not in tropical heat. The US military specifications required chocolate that could withstand temperatures up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit without becoming a gooey mess in soldiers' pockets. These chocolate bars contained more than sugar and cocoa. They were packed with concentrated calories and designed to provide quick energy during combat. Some varieties included vitamins and minerals to supplement the limited variety in field rations. Soldiers often saved their chocolate for the worst moments, using it as emergency fuel when everything else seemed hopeless. And the weird part is how chocolate became a currency of sorts. Soldiers traded chocolate bars for local goods, information, or favors from civilians. In occupied territories, American chocolate was worth more than money because it represented something genuinely valuable, concentrated nutrition and a taste of the outside world. Vitamin tablets revolutionized military health by solving a problem armies had faced for centuries. Scurvy, beriberi, and other nutritional diseases had killed more soldiers throughout history than enemy bullets. Compressing essential vitamins into small pills meant soldiers could maintain their health even when eating the same limited foods for months. But why stop at basic nutrition? Military food scientists realized they could use these tablets to enhance performance beyond just preventing disease. They experimented with vitamin combinations designed to improve night vision, increase stamina, and even boost morale. Some of these experiments worked better than others, but the research laid the foundation for modern sports nutrition and dietary supplements. The lasting impact of these wartime food innovations reaches far beyond military applications. Freeze-drying technology developed for field rations eventually gave us instant coffee and astronaut ice cream. The research into shelf-stable foods led to modern MREs, meals ready to eat, and influenced civilian emergency preparedness. Food packaging innovations from WWII changed grocery stores forever. Those convenient TV dinners, they trace their ancestry directly back to military field rations. The idea that complete balanced meals could be packaged, preserved, and heated quickly revolutionized how busy families approached dinner time in the post-war era. But perhaps the most significant change was in our understanding of nutrition itself. The military's systematic approach to feeding large numbers of people efficiently influenced everything from school lunch programs to modern dietary guidelines. When you read nutrition labels today, you're seeing descendants of systems developed to keep soldiers fighting. Speaking of keeping soldiers fighting, proper nutrition was just one piece of the puzzle. When bullets started flying and soldiers got wounded, entirely different innovations became matters of life and death. When a soldier got shot during World War II, infection killed more people than the actual bullets. Crazy, right? A tiny scratch could turn deadly within days. But then something incredible happened that changed medicine forever. Alexander Fleming had discovered penicillin back in 1928, almost by accident. He left some bacteria samples out, and mold contaminated them. Most scientists would have thrown the rubbish away. Fleming noticed something weird. The mold was killing the bacteria around it. He thought, well, that's interesting, and kept investigating. But here's the thing. Nobody could figure out how to make enough penicillin to actually help people. It took a world war to force scientists to crack that puzzle. By 1943, American and British labs were working around the clock. They needed tons of the stuff, not just tiny laboratory samples. Scientists discovered that deep fermentation tanks, the kind used for brewing beer, could grow massive amounts of penicillin mold. Suddenly, what used to save maybe one person could save thousands. The first soldiers to receive penicillin shots recovered from infections that would have killed them just months earlier. Word spread fast through military hospitals. Then there were sulfur drugs, which arrived before penicillin hit the battlefield in large quantities. These yellow pills fought infections differently, but they worked. Medics stuffed sulfur powder directly into bullet wounds. The powder looked like bright yellow sand, and it stung like crazy when applied. Soldiers called it devil's dust because of the burning sensation, but they begged for it anyway. Better to hurt for a few minutes than die from gangrene. But what about pain relief? Morphine had existed for decades, but carrying glass vials and needles into combat was nearly impossible. Enter the morphine syringe. Mighty, basically a tiny tube that looked like a toothpaste container with a needle attached. Medics could inject morphine with one hand while dragging wounded soldiers to safety with the other. The empty syringes got pinned to the patient's uniform so doctors would know how much morphine they'd already received. Simple, but brilliant. Blood loss was another massive killer. Soldiers were bleeding to death faster than they could reach proper hospitals. Scientists developed plasma storage bags that could keep donated blood fresh for weeks. Unlike whole blood, plasma didn't need refrigeration and could be given to anyone regardless of blood type. Field medics carried these bags everywhere, turning battlefield aid stations into mini blood banks. The bags were made from a new plastic material that didn't break when dropped or frozen. Let's not forget how basic first aid changed during the war. Every soldier got issued a personal first aid kit, something that seems obvious now but was revolutionary then. These kits contained bandages, antiseptic, and pain pills all packed into a waterproof container smaller than a paperback book. Before the war, only specially trained medics carried medical supplies. Suddenly, every private could treat wounds and potentially save lives. The weird part is how fast these medical advances spread. Information that normally took years to travel between hospitals was shared in months through military medical networks. Army doctors in the Pacific were using techniques developed in European field hospitals within weeks of their discovery. This rapid knowledge sharing saved countless lives and accelerated medical progress by decades. Field hospitals became testing grounds for surgical techniques still used today. Doctors performed operations in tents, often by candlelight or flashlight when generators failed. They had to work fast, with limited supplies, under constant threat of enemy attack. These extreme conditions forced medical innovation. Surgeons developed ways to operate that were quicker, more efficient, and used fewer resources than peacetime methods. Evacuation procedures revolutionized trauma care too. The concept of golden hour, mitis getting critically wounded patients to advanced medical care within 60 minutes, emerged from wartime experience. As medical personnel realized that speed often mattered more than elaborate treatment at the injury site. Get them stable, get them moving, save their lives later. Mental health treatment also evolved, though people didn't talk about it much back then. Doctors started recognizing that soldiers could be wounded in ways that didn't show up as physical injuries. They developed new approaches for what they called battle fatigue or shell shock. Simple techniques like rest, hot food, and talking through traumatic experiences helped soldiers recover and return to duty. The ripple effects reached civilian medicine almost immediately. Penicillin became available to the general public shortly after the war ended. Surgical techniques perfected in field hospitals improved operations in regular hospitals. Blood banking systems expanded to serve entire cities, not just military units. All these medical breakthroughs happened because war created urgent need and unlimited funding for solutions. When people are dying by the thousands, bureaucracy disappears and innovation explodes. But while doctors were saving lives with new medicines, engineers were working on completely different problems. They needed better ways to fix broken equipment quickly, and their solutions would end up in every home and office in America. During wartime, soldiers often faced a frustrating problem. Equipment broke at the worst possible moments. A crucial airplane part would crack during a mission. An ammunition box would spring a leak in the middle of combat. Radio equipment would fail when communication was most needed. Engineers desperately needed solutions that could work instantly, even under the worst conditions imaginable. Enter two remarkable inventions that would change how people fix things forever. Both came from the pressure cooker environment of WWII, where failure wasn't just inconvenient, it could mean the difference between life and death. The first breakthrough happened when scientists were trying to create clear plastic gun sights for aircraft. Dr. Harry Coover was working with cyanoacrylates in 1942, attempting to make crystal clear plastic for precision optics. But something went wrong. Well, actually something went spectacularly right. The chemical compound he created stuck to absolutely everything it touched, and we mean everything. Coover initially thought this was a disaster. How could you make gun sights from a substance that glued itself permanently to every surface? His team couldn't even remove their test samples from the equipment. They'd accidentally created the world's strongest adhesive when they were trying to make transparent plastic. Talk about missing the target entirely, but then military engineers realized what they actually had. This superglue could bond airplane parts in seconds, no waiting for epoxy to cure overnight, no complicated mixing ratios, just a tiny drop, pressed together, and boom, stronger than the original material. Aircraft mechanics could repair critical components in minutes rather than hours. The military classified superglue immediately. Fighter planes were literally being held together by this miraculous substance, and nobody wanted enemies getting their hands on it. Pilots would carry tiny tubes for emergency repairs during missions. One drop could seal a fuel line leak, or reattach a loose instrument panel. Then there's the second invention, born from pure maternal frustration. Vesta Stout worked at an ammunition factory in Illinois, packing cartridges for soldiers overseas. She had 2 sons fighting in the Pacific, and she knew exactly how important reliable equipment was. The problem: ammunition boxes were sealed with paper tape that would fail when wet. Soldiers in jungle conditions couldn't open their ammo when they needed it most. Stout had an idea. What if they used a strong waterproof tape instead? She wrote directly to President Franklin Roosevelt, explaining how paper tape was putting American soldiers at risk. Her letter worked its way through military channels until it reached the right engineers. The result was revolutionary. They created a cloth-backed waterproof tape with incredibly strong adhesive. Originally colored olive green for military use, soldiers quickly discovered this tape could fix absolutely anything. Tank treads, radio equipment, weapon stocks, helmets, boots. If it was broken, this miracle tape could repair it. Soldiers nicknamed it 100-mile-an-hour tape, because it supposedly stayed stuck even at high speeds. Others called it hurricane tape for its weather resistance. The official name was pressure-sensitive adhesive tape. but everyone just called it by what it was originally designed to seal: ducts and ammunition containers. Duct tape, or as we know it today, duct tape. The weird part is how these two inventions saved lives in completely unexpected ways. Superglue turned out to be perfect for emergency medical treatment. Medics discovered they could literally glue wounds closed when traditional sutures weren't available. Soldiers in remote locations could stop bleeding instantly with a few drops of this adhesive. Field surgeons used it for quick repairs during combat operations. Meanwhile, duct tape became the universal problem solver. Need to silence a squeaky weapon? Duct tape. Broken radio antenna? Duct tape. Torn uniform letting in cold air? You guessed it. Some soldiers claimed they could repair an entire jeep with enough duct tape and determination. But here's what makes these inventions truly remarkable. They worked perfectly in conditions where nothing else would. Superglue bonded in freezing temperatures, scorching heat, and even underwater. Duct tape stuck to dirty, wet, or oily surfaces, where regular adhesives failed completely. Both were designed for the absolute worst-case scenarios imaginable. After the war, manufacturers realized they had stumbled onto something huge. Civilians wanted these miracle fix-it tools for their own problems. Superglue hit store shelves in the 1950s, marketed as the adhesive that could bond anything permanently. Duct tape followed shortly after, becoming the go-to repair solution for everything from household appliances to spacecraft. Today, both inventions remain essentially unchanged from their wartime formulas. That's the mark of truly brilliant engineering, when a solution works so perfectly that you can't improve it decades later. Speaking of wartime innovations that transformed everyday life, there's another invention that revolutionized how people write and work. The ballpoint pen might seem boring compared to radar and jet engines, but this simple writing tool actually saved lives during World War II. Fountain pens were the standard back then. Elegant things that writers and businessmen carried with pride. But try flying a bomber at 30,000 feet with a fountain pen, and you'd quickly discover why pilots were desperate for something better. At high altitudes, fountain pens turned into useless leaky messes. The ink would freeze solid in cold cockpits. Or worse, the pressure changes would cause them to explode ink all over crucial flight maps and navigation charts. Imagine trying to read your coordinates home when they're covered in blue ink splotches. Not exactly ideal when enemy fighters are hunting you down. Hungarian journalist Laszlo Biro had been working on a solution since the late 1930s. He noticed that newspaper ink dried quickly and didn't smudge like fountain pen ink. The problem was getting that thicker ink to flow through a pen tip. His breakthrough came from watching children play with marbles. What if a tiny ball could roll the ink onto paper, picking it up from a cartridge inside the pen? Biro's early prototypes were clunky and expensive, but they worked. The ball bearing at the tip rotated as you wrote, coating itself with ink from the internal reservoir, and transferring it smoothly to paper. No pressure sensitivity like fountain pens, no altitude problems, no freezing ink disasters. When Britain's Royal Air Force heard about this miracle pen, they didn't hesitate. The RAF placed an order for 30,000 ballpoint pens specifically for their pilots and navigators. These weren't cheap office supplies. Each pen cost about what a worker might earn in a week. But when you're flying dangerous missions over enemy territory, reliable writing equipment becomes a matter of life and death. The pens worked flawlessly in conditions that would destroy fountain pens. Fighter pilots could jot down radio frequencies while pulling high G turns. Bomber navigators could mark their positions on maps even when their breath was freezing in the cockpit. The fast-drying ink meant no smearing when hands were shaking from cold or adrenaline. Then there's the durability factor that really mattered in combat. Fountain pens had delicate nibs that bent or broke easily. Drop one wrong and you're stuck with useless metal and plastic. Ballpoint pens could take serious abuse. Pilots reported their pens still working after crash landings, after being dropped from aircraft, even after getting soaked in rain or seawater during rescue operations. The technology behind these wartime pens was surprisingly sophisticated. The ball bearing had to be perfectly spherical and precisely fitted to its socket. Too loose and the ink would leak everywhere. Too tight and it wouldn't roll smoothly. The ink formula required careful chemistry, thick enough not to leak, thin enough to flow consistently, quick drying but not so fast it would clog the ball mechanism. American forces caught on quickly once they saw how well the British pens performed. The US military started ordering thousands of ballpoints for their own pilots and officers. Word spread through the ranks about these amazing pens that worked in any weather, at any altitude, in any conditions where regular pens failed miserably. But here's where things get interesting for civilians back home. The ballpoint pen remained an expensive military secret during most of the war. Ordinary people had no idea this revolutionary writing instrument even existed. They were still struggling with fountain pens and pencils while their sons and husbands overseas had access to space-age writing technology. The war's end changed everything. Soldiers returned home carrying their ballpoint pens, showing them off to amazed friends and family. Entrepreneurs realized the massive commercial potential. In 1945, Gimbel's department store in New York announced they would sell ballpoint pens to the public for the first time. The response was absolutely insane. Gimbel's had ordered 10,000 pens, pricing them at $12.50 each, roughly $150 in today's money. They expected the pens to sell gradually over several weeks. Instead, crowds formed outside the store before opening. Police had to control the mob of customers desperate to buy these miracle pens they'd heard about from returning veterans. All 10,000 pens sold out on the first day. The store had to hire extra security guards and set up rope barriers to manage the chaos. People were literally fighting to buy ballpoint pens, treating them like some kind of magical artifact. Manufacturing costs dropped rapidly as production scaled up. Within a few years, ballpoint pens became affordable for everyone. The same technology that helped win the war transformed into the most common writing instrument on Earth. What started as a solution for pilots in freezing cockpits ended up in every purse, pocket, and desk drawer worldwide. Every grocery list, every school assignment, every love letter owes a debt to those wartime aviators who needed something better than a fountain pen. Speaking of things that detected trouble from far away, there's another wartime invention that literally saved entire cities. Imagine trying to fight an invisible enemy that comes from the sky. Before radar, that's exactly what every country faced. Enemy planes could sneak up like ghosts, drop their bombs, and disappear before anyone knew what hit them. Air raid sirens wailed after the damage was already done. The British figured out something revolutionary. What if they could bounce radio waves off metal objects and listen for the echo? Sounds simple now, but back then it was pure genius. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, hit something solid, then bounce back like a tennis ball against a wall. Time the echo, do some quick math, and suddenly you know exactly where that enemy bomber is hiding. But here's the crazy part. Britain almost kept this technology too secret for their own good. The first radar stations looked like giant metal towers stretching along the English coast. German spies probably thought they were fancy radio antennas for broadcasting music. The Brits were perfectly happy letting them think that. Chain Home became Britain's electronic fence against Nazi Germany. These radar stations could spot incoming German bombers when they were still 120 miles away. That gave British fighter pilots almost 20 minutes to scramble into the sky and get into position. 20 minutes doesn't sound like much, but it meant the difference between shooting down enemy planes over the ocean versus letting them bomb London. The technology wasn't perfect though. Early radar operators sat in dark rooms, staring at green screens that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Tiny blips of light showed where planes were flying, but telling friend from enemy required serious skill. One wrong guess could mean shooting down your own guys. Then there's the story of how radar accidentally saved lives in ways nobody expected. Ship captains finally had electronic eyes that could see through fog and darkness. Before radar, naval collisions happened constantly during wartime blackouts. Ships would ram into each other trying to avoid enemy submarines. Radar changed all that practically overnight. Anti-aircraft guns got a massive upgrade too. Gunners no longer had to guess where fast-moving planes might be in 5 seconds. Radar showed them exactly where to aim. German pilots started noticing that British anti-aircraft fire was becoming unnaturally accurate, especially at night. They had no idea invisible radio waves were tracking their every move. The Germans weren't sitting around doing nothing either. They developed their own radar systems and discovered something interesting about British radar. Those chain home stations had a blind spot. Low-flying planes could sneak underneath the radar beam and approach undetected. German fighter bombers started skimming just above the ocean waves during surprise attacks. What really makes you think about the future is how radar operators became the world's first air traffic controllers. Before the war ended, radar stations were guiding friendly planes to safe landings during bad weather. Controllers could see every aircraft in their area and direct them away from collisions. Commercial aviation after the war adopted these exact same techniques. Weather prediction got a boost from radar experiments too. Rain, snow, and storms reflect radio waves just like metal airplanes do. Meteorologists realized they could track weather patterns in real time instead of just guessing based on yesterday's conditions. Hurricane tracking and tornado warnings trace their roots directly back to wartime radar development. Naval warfare transformed completely once radar moved onto ships. Battleships could engage enemy vessels beyond visual range during night battles. Submarine hunters used radar to spot periscopes poking above the water's surface. The age of surprise naval attacks was basically over. Aircraft carriers became floating radar command centers. Fighter planes could be guided to enemy formations by radar operators watching from ships dozens of miles away. Pilots received directions through their radio headsets. Enemy bombers, 15 degrees left, altitude 8,000 feet. This coordination between radar and radio communication revolutionized air combat tactics. The most surprising radar application involved search and rescue operations. Downed pilots floating in life rafts could be spotted by radar-equipped planes much faster than using binoculars alone. Radar operators learned to distinguish between small boats, debris, and actual survivors based on how the radar echoes moved with ocean waves. By war's end, radar had evolved far beyond its original purpose of detecting enemy aircraft. Mobile radar units could be loaded onto trucks and moved wherever needed. Portable radar systems guided artillery fire and tracked enemy troop movements. The technology that started as Britain's secret weapon against German bombers was reshaping military strategy worldwide. But radar's biggest impact was still coming after the war ended. Every modern airport depends on radar for safe takeoffs and landings. Weather forecasters use radar to track storms and warn people about dangerous conditions. Even police radar guns that catch speeding drivers use the same basic principles developed during those desperate early years of World War II. Speaking of technology that moved from military to civilian use, there's another wartime invention that was making waves beneath the ocean's surface. When radar could spot planes flying through the sky, the underwater world remained stubbornly mysterious. Enemy submarines lurked beneath the waves like mechanical sharks, invisible and deadly. Ships sailed above them completely blind, never knowing when a torpedo might come racing toward their hull. Then sonar changed everything. The technology worked by sending sound waves through the water and listening for echoes. When those waves hit something solid, like a submarine trying to hide, they bounced back to the surface ship. The time it took for the echo to return told operators exactly how far away the target was. Simple physics, but it revolutionized naval warfare overnight. British destroyers suddenly had underwater eyes. They could track German U-boats that had been sinking merchant ships with impunity. What had been a deadly game of blind hide-and-seek became something closer to a fair fight. Well, fair if you consider having dozens of surface ships hunting a single submarine fair. Let's not forget how terrifying this must have been for submarine crews. One day they're invisible predators ruling the depths. The next day, enemy ships above them are calling out their exact position over the radio. The hunters had become the hunted, and they had nowhere to run in the vast emptiness of the ocean. American submarines in the Pacific used sonar to navigate through dangerous coral reefs and spot Japanese warships from miles away. The technology worked both ways. Submarines could listen for surface ships just as effectively as ships could hunt submarines. Every captain became part detective, part hunter, interpreting the pings and echoes that revealed the hidden underwater battlefield. But sonar wasn't the only underwater innovation changing the rules of war. Magnetic mines presented a completely different problem. These devilish devices didn't need direct contact to explode. They sensed the metal hull of a passing ship and detonated automatically. Traditional mines at least had the courtesy to blow up only when you actually hit them. Magnetic mines were far more sinister. They could destroy you just for sailing too close. Without sonar, these mines were nearly impossible to detect. They sat quietly on the ocean floor, waiting patiently for their magnetic sensors to detect approaching steel. Minesweepers had to develop entirely new techniques, using powerful electromagnets to trigger the mines from a safe distance. The whole process was like defusing a bomb while blindfolded, except the bomb could sense you coming. Then there were the frogmen, the underwater commandos who seemed like something from a spy novel. These brave souls used early scuba gear and rebreathers to sneak into enemy harbors completely undetected. They would swim for hours in freezing water, carrying explosives to attach to the hulls of warships. The rebreathers were crucial because they didn't produce bubbles that might give away their position. Regular scuba gear sends a stream of telltale air bubbles to the surface, a dead giveaway for any alert sentry. Rebreathers recycled the divers' exhaled air, scrubbing out the carbon dioxide and adding fresh oxygen. Silent, invisible, and deadly effective. Italian frogmen were particularly skilled at this underwater sabotage. They rode tiny submarines called human torpedoes right into heavily defended British harbours. The submarines weren't much bigger than motorcycles, but they carried enough explosives to sink a battleship. Talk about getting maximum bang for your buck. Depth charges became the primary weapon for hunting submarines once sonar revealed their hiding spots. These barrel-shaped explosives were dropped from ships and set to explode at specific depths. The underwater pressure wave from the explosion could crack a submarine's hull even without a direct hit. The trick was getting the timing right. Drop depth charges too shallow, and the submarine escapes by diving deeper. Too deep, and you waste your ammunition while the sub slips away. Sonar operators had to calculate the submarine's depth, speed and direction, then predict exactly where it would be when the depth charges reached the right depth. Military mathematics at its most urgent. What's really wild is how WWII sonar research accidentally launched the entire field of ocean exploration. Scientists studying sound waves underwater discovered they could map the ocean floor with incredible precision. Those same techniques revealed underwater mountain ranges, deep ocean trenches, and the complex topography of the sea bottom. After the war, fishing boats started using sonar to locate schools of fish. Oceanographers used it to study whale migration patterns and discover new species in the deep ocean. The technology designed to hunt enemy submarines became a tool for understanding our planet's last unexplored frontier. Modern GPS and underwater navigation systems trace their roots directly back to these wartime innovations. Every depth finder on today's fishing boats, every submarine navigation system, every underwater research vessel owes its existence to the urgent need to see beneath the waves during World War II. Speaking of seeing things that were previously invisible, the war also sparked a revolution in how documents and information could be copied and shared. Stuck in a rented room above a bar in Queens, Chester Carlson was getting desperate. The year was 1938, and this patent attorney had a problem that was driving him crazy. Every time he needed copies of legal documents, he had to either retype everything by hand or use messy carbon paper that smudged everywhere. His arthritis made typing painful, and carbon copies looked terrible. There had to be a better way. What happened next in that cramped room would eventually put a copying machine in every office around the world. But first Carlson had to figure out some seriously weird science. He'd been experimenting with something called electrostatic attraction, basically the same force that makes your socks stick to your shirt when you pull them out of the dryer. Carlson thought maybe, just maybe, he could use static electricity to transfer images from one piece of paper to another. His wife thought he'd lost his mind. The smell of sulfur from his experiments was making their apartment reek like rotten eggs. On October 22, 1938, Carlson and his assistant Otto Cornet rubbed a zinc plate with a cotton cloth to build up static charge. They placed a glass slide on top with October 22, 38 Astoria written in India ink. After exposing it to bright light and dusting it with lycopodium powder, they pressed a piece of wax paper against it. When they peeled the paper away, there it was. The world's first photocopy. The image was backwards and barely readable, but it worked. Carlson had just invented xerography, though he called it electrophotography back then. The name xerography came later from Greek words meaning dry writing. Here's where things get interesting for the war effort. While Carlson was shopping his invention around to companies, World War II was creating an enormous demand for document copying. Patent offices were drowning in paperwork. Military contractors needed multiple copies of blueprints and technical drawings. Intelligence agencies wanted to duplicate captured enemy documents without damaging the originals. But nobody wanted Carlson's machine. IBM turned him down. Kodak said no thanks. General Electric wasn't interested. For 6 years, rejection after rejection piled up. 20 companies told him his invention was worthless. Some executives couldn't even understand why anyone would want to copy documents when carbon paper existed. The breakthrough came in 1944 when Battelle Memorial Institute, a research organization, finally saw the potential. They gave Carlson funding to improve his process, and more importantly, they had connections to government contracts. During the war, Battelle was working on everything from uranium processing to military equipment. They understood that copying technology could be incredibly valuable for defense work. Then there's the timing factor that most people miss. While the first commercial laserography machine wouldn't hit the market until 1959, the fundamental research and development happened during the war years. Military needs were driving innovation in ways that peacetime business never could. The urgency of war made people think differently about what was possible. The weird part is how xerography actually works. It's like magic, but with science. A metal drum gets an electric charge. Light hits the original document and reflects onto the drum, but only from the white areas. The black letters and images stay charged on the drum. Toner powder sticks to these charged areas, then transfers to paper and gets heated until it melts and sticks permanently. Battelle's wartime research solved the biggest technical problems. They figured out how to make the process faster and more reliable. They developed better photoconductor materials. Most importantly, they proved that xerography could handle the volume of copying that large organizations needed. Patent offices and government agencies were perfect testing grounds. What's fascinating is how military secrecy actually helped the invention. While Battelle was improving xerography, their work was often classified. This meant competitors couldn't steal the technology or rush inferior products to market. The secrecy gave Carlson and his team time to perfect their process without interference. By 1947, a small company called Halode Corporation licensed the xerography patents. They eventually changed their name to Xerox, and the rest is history. But the foundation was laid during those crucial war years, when document copying went from a luxury to an absolute necessity. The military applications were obvious once people started thinking about them. Field commanders needed multiple copies of battle plans. Intelligence officers wanted to reproduce captured documents. Supply officers required copies of requisition forms. The old methods of hand copying or carbon paper simply couldn't keep up with wartime demands. Chester Carlson's invention emerged from wartime necessity and transformed how the world handles information. But that same period of rapid innovation was producing another breakthrough that would change espionage forever. Intelligence agencies weren't just copying enemy documents. They were finding increasingly creative ways to hide their own messages in plain sight. World War II created a strange new profession, professional sneakiness. Spies needed gadgets that would make James Bond jealous. Except these were real and often more clever than anything Hollywood dreamed up. The microdot might be the most brilliant invention nobody talks about. Picture trying to hide an entire page of text inside a photograph. German spies figured out how to shrink documents down to the size of a period at the end of this sentence. They'd stick these tiny dots over punctuation marks in innocent-looking letters. A postcard from your aunt might actually contain stolen military plans hiding in plain sight. The technology was so advanced that Allied intelligence didn't even know microdots existed until 1941, when an FBI lab accidentally discovered one while examining a seemingly harmless telegram. Then there's invisible ink, which sounds like kids' stuff until you realize how sophisticated it became. Early versions used lemon juice or milk. Heat the paper and the writing appeared. But wartime spies upgraded this ancient trick into something far more clever. They developed inks that only showed up under specific chemical treatments or ultraviolet light. Some required 2 different solutions applied in the right order, others disappeared again after a few hours, leaving no trace they ever existed. German agents even created ink that looked like regular fountain pen ink until treated with the right developer. Secret cameras became ridiculously small and creative. Engineers squeezed working cameras into cigarette lighters, fountain pens and even coat buttons. The Minox camera, originally designed in Latvia, became legendary among spies. It was barely larger than a pack of gum, but took crystal-clear photographs of documents. Some agents carried cameras disguised as wristwatches or hidden inside fake books. The challenge wasn't just making them small, they had to work perfectly under pressure, often in terrible lighting conditions. Exploding briefcases solved a very specific problem. What happens when a spy gets caught with sensitive documents? The briefcase looked completely normal from the outside, but hidden inside was a small incendiary device. Pull a concealed wire, or twist a secret mechanism, and the contents burst into flames within seconds. Everything burned completely. Papers turned to ash, leaving no evidence behind. These weren't Hollywood explosions that blew up buildings. They were precise, contained fires that destroyed information while keeping the spy relatively safe. Communication devices got wonderfully weird. Agents needed ways to talk that seemed completely innocent to anyone listening. Radio operators developed systems where music broadcasts contained coded messages. A jazz song played at a specific time might signal an upcoming operation. Even more clever were the fake radio stations that broadcast normal-sounding programs, while embedding secret instructions in seemingly random comments or song selections. The weirdest gadgets often came from unexpected problems. Agents operating in cold climates needed cameras that wouldn't freeze. Those working in tropical areas required equipment that wouldn't rust or jam from humidity. Some carried fake teeth with hidden compartments for poison or secret documents. Others had shoes with hollow heels for storing money, maps, or emergency supplies. Code breaking inspired its own strange inventions. Beyond the famous Enigma machine, both sides created mechanical devices that looked like typewriters but actually generated unbreakable codes. Some used rotating wheels with thousands of possible combinations. Others employed mathematical formulas so complex that even knowing the system wouldn't help without the daily key settings. Breaking these codes required machines as elaborate as the ones that created them. Timing devices became crucial for coordinated operations. Agents needed ways to synchronize activities across different locations without radio contact. They developed wind-up mechanisms that could trigger events hours or even days later. Some looked like ordinary alarm clocks but were actually precision instruments for coordinating sabotage missions or information drops. The psychology of spy gadgets mattered as much as the technology. Items had to look so normal that even suspicious guards wouldn't give them a second glance. A briefcase couldn't be too nice or too cheap. It had to perfectly match what that type of person would realistically carry. Fountain pens needed the right weight and feel. Cameras disguised as books required covers that made sense for someone's supposed occupation. Training with these devices became an art form. Agents practiced using hidden cameras until they could photograph documents in complete darkness, working entirely by touch. They memorized the exact pressure needed to activate secret mechanisms without looking suspicious. Some learned to operate radio equipment while maintaining normal conversations, simultaneously encoding messages and chatting about the weather. These wartime innovations laid the groundwork for everything that followed during the Cold War. The techniques developed for hiding information, creating undetectable communication systems, and building miniaturized electronics became the foundation for decades of espionage technology. But while spies worried about staying hidden and destroying evidence, other inventors focused on an entirely different challenge: keeping wounded soldiers alive long enough to reach proper medical care. When soldiers got hurt during World War II, they couldn't just call an ambulance and wait 20 minutes for help. Battlefield medicine had to be fast, portable, and work under the worst possible conditions. Army doctors needed tools that could save lives while bullets flew overhead and bombs exploded nearby. The old stretchers were basically death traps on wheels, heavy, clunky, and nearly impossible to move across rough terrain. But then military engineers created something revolutionary: lightweight stretchers with actual wheels that could roll smoothly over dirt, rocks, and debris. These weren't your typical hospital gurneys. They folded up compact enough to carry into combat zones, yet strong enough to transport wounded soldiers across miles of dangerous ground. Here's where things get really interesting. Before the war, if you wanted an X-ray, you had to visit a hospital with massive room-sized equipment. Doctors in the field had no way to see inside broken bodies. Well, that changed fast when portable X-ray machines appeared on battlefields. These compact units ran on generators and could reveal broken bones, internal injuries, and embedded shrapnel in minutes rather than hours. The speed of diagnosis literally meant the difference between life and death. A medic could instantly see if a soldier had a fractured skull or just a nasty bump. No more guessing games when every second counted. Then there were the folding splints that army medics carried in their packs. Traditional splints were wooden boards that took up tons of space and weren't exactly practical when you're crawling through mud. Military designers created collapsible metal splints that snapped into shape when needed. They weighed almost nothing, fit in small pouches, and could stabilize any broken bone from fingers to legs. But wait, there's more to this medical revolution. Battlefield surgery kits came with their own compact sterilizers that could clean instruments in the field. These weren't fancy hospital autoclaves, they were portable pressure cookers designed specifically for combat medicine. Surgeons could perform life-saving operations right there in makeshift field hospitals with properly sterilized tools. The sterilizers used steam under pressure to kill bacteria and viruses in minutes. No electricity required, just heat from small portable stoves. This breakthrough allowed doctors to set up operating rooms practically anywhere, from abandoned buildings to large tents behind battle lines. Fast evacuation vehicles changed everything about rescuing wounded soldiers. The famous meat wagons weren't glamorous, but they were incredibly effective. These armored ambulances could drive straight into combat zones, load up injured troops, and race back to safety at high speeds. They had special suspension systems that minimized jolting for patients with spinal injuries. Some evacuation vehicles were amphibious. They could drive on land and float across rivers without stopping. Others had tank-like treads that could climb over obstacles that would stop regular trucks. The goal was simple: get wounded soldiers to medical help as fast as humanly possible, no matter what stood in the way. Medical innovation extended to pain management too. Morphine syrettes became standard issue for every soldier. These were small, disposable syringes pre-filled with painkiller that anyone could use without medical training. Just stab and squeeze. They prevented wounded soldiers from going into shock while waiting for proper medical attention. The really clever part: each syrette had a safety pin that medics would attach to the patient's uniform after injection. This prevented dangerous overdoses when multiple medics treated the same wounded soldier. Plasma storage revolutionized blood transfusions on battlefields. Before this breakthrough, soldiers with severe blood loss usually died because fresh blood wasn't available in combat zones. Plasma could be stored for weeks without refrigeration and mixed with saline solution to create life-saving transfusions anywhere. Military hospitals started using plasma banks that could supply multiple operating tables simultaneously. A single plasma donation could potentially save several lives, making every pint incredibly valuable. First aid training became mandatory for all troops, not just medics. Every soldier learned to stop bleeding, treat burns, and recognize symptoms of serious injuries. Standard issue first aid kits contained bandages, antiseptic, tourniquets, and basic surgical supplies. These kits were waterproof and designed to work in extreme temperatures. Soldiers in Arctic conditions or tropical jungles could count on their medical supplies functioning properly when needed most. Emergency dental care couldn't be ignored either. Dental kits included temporary fillings, pain relievers, and tools for extracting damaged teeth. A severe toothache might seem minor compared to gunshot wounds, but infected teeth could put soldiers out of action for weeks. Military medicine during World War II saved hundreds of thousands of lives through pure innovation and determination. These advances didn't stay on battlefields. They transformed civilian healthcare forever. Speaking of keeping soldiers healthy and ready for action, the military had to completely rethink how troops dressed for different climates and combat situations. The clothing revolution was about to change warfare in ways nobody expected. When bullets started flying, fashion took a backseat to survival. But here's the twist: war didn't just change what soldiers wore, it completely revolutionized how we dress today. The zipper had been around since the 1890s, but nobody really cared about it until World War II. Combat boots with laces, that's precious time wasted when enemy shells are incoming. Zipper boots became standard issue because soldiers could slip them on in seconds. No fumbling with knots in the dark, no frozen fingers struggling with wet laces during a dawn raid. The military bought millions of pairs, and suddenly zippers weren't just a curiosity, they were essential technology. After the war, civilians realized zippers made sense for everything. Jackets, pants, bags. That morning routine just got faster. Then there's camouflage, which sounds obvious now, but was actually revolutionary thinking. Before WWII, armies wore bright colors to identify friend from foe. Red coats, blue uniforms, shiny brass buttons, parade ground pretty, battlefield stupid. German forces developed specific patterns for different environments: woodland green for forests, tan and brown for deserts, white for snow. The science behind it was fascinating. They studied how the human eye processes shapes and colors, then created patterns that broke up a soldier's outline. Not just random splotches, but carefully designed disruption. American forces took this concept and ran with it. They created the iconic duck hunter pattern that many people still recognize today. But the really clever part: different units got different patterns based on where they'd fight. Pacific Theater got jungle greens, European forces got earth tones, Arctic troops got white and gray. Makes sense, right? But let's talk about something that saved more lives than people realize: flak jackets. Flying metal shards from exploding shells were killing more airmen than direct hits. The solution wasn't to make planes more armored, which would slow them down. Instead, they armored the people. Early flak jackets used overlapping steel plates sewn into heavy canvas vests. They looked medieval, weighed about 20 pounds, and were hot as blazes. Pilots complained constantly about them, well, until they started getting shot at. Then those same pilots refused to fly without their steel underwear, as they called it. The jackets couldn't stop direct bullet hits, but they deflected shrapnel beautifully. Survival rates for bomber crews jumped significantly once flak jackets became mandatory. Modern bulletproof vests trace their design directly back to these WWII innovations. Arctic warfare created its own clothing revolution. Regular wool coats weren't cutting it when temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Military designers developed layered systems: base layer, insulation layer, wind-resistant outer shell. The famous wool-lined parka became standard issue for troops fighting in Alaska, Northern Europe, and the Eastern Front. These weren't just warm coats. They were survival systems engineered to keep soldiers functional in conditions that would kill civilians. The weird part is how these parkas influenced post-war fashion. Soldiers returning home brought their military-issued cold-weather gear, and suddenly heavy-duty winter coats became popular with hunters, construction workers, and anyone else working outdoors. The military surplus clothing trend started right there. Let's not forget about the small details that made huge differences. Buttonless shirts appeared because buttons caught on equipment and took too long to fasten under fire. Snap fasteners, and later, Velcro, made more sense for combat uniforms. Soldiers needed to dress and undress quickly for medical treatment or equipment changes. Velcro itself has an interesting war connection. While the hook and loop fastener wasn't invented until after WWII, the military immediately recognized its potential. Early versions showed up on uniforms in the 1950s, but the concept of quick-release clothing fasteners definitely started during the war years. Pockets became serious business too. Civilian clothes had maybe 2 or 3 pockets. Military uniforms needed storage for ammunition, maps, medical supplies, food, tools, and personal items. Designers created cargo pockets, hidden pockets, waterproof pockets, and quick access pockets. The famous cargo pants that became popular in the 1990s, straight military heritage. Combat clothing also had to be practical for mass production. Millions of uniforms needed manufacturing quickly and cheaply. This pushed textile companies to develop synthetic materials and efficient production methods. The clothing industry learned to make durable, functional garments at scale, lessons that changed civilian fashion forever. Even underwear got a military makeover. Cotton briefs replaced longer underwear because they dried faster and caused fewer hygiene problems in field conditions. T-shirts became standard issue as lightweight base layers. Both became permanent parts of men's wardrobes after soldiers returned home wearing them. But warfare wasn't just changing what people wore, it was revolutionizing how they moved through the sky, and that required some pretty incredible innovations to keep pilots alive at crushing altitudes. When you think about rockets hitting London from nearly 200 miles away in 1943, it sounds like science fiction, but the German V-2 rocket made this terrifying reality possible, becoming the world's first ballistic missile and grandfather to every space program that followed. These weren't just bigger bombs, they were engineering marvels that traveled faster than sound and arrived without warning. The V-2 stood over 46 feet tall and weighed 27,000 pounds when fully fueled. What made it truly revolutionary? It burned liquid oxygen and ethyl alcohol, reaching speeds of 3,500 miles per hour. That's roughly 5 times faster than a bullet. By the time you heard one coming, it had already hit its target and exploded. The psychological impact was devastating. Londoners called them silent death because there was no air raid siren, no time to run to shelters. But here's where things get really interesting. The same German engineer who designed these weapons of destruction, Wernher von Braun, later became the mastermind behind America's moon landing. Talk about a career pivot. His V-2 technology directly led to the Saturn V rocket that put Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface. Without WWI's rocket experiments, we might still be earthbound today. Then there's the proximity fuse, possibly the most game-changing invention most people have never heard of. Before this clever device, anti-aircraft guns had to score direct hits on enemy planes to bring them down. That's like trying to hit a flying baseball with another baseball while blindfolded. The proximity fuse changed everything by using radio waves to detect when a shell passed close to an aircraft, then exploding automatically. American and British scientists developed this technology in absolute secrecy. They were so paranoid about the Germans discovering it that they initially refused to use proximity fuses over enemy territory. Why? They feared a dud shell might fall into German hands, revealing the secret. The fuse only saw widespread use during the Pacific Campaign, where most fighting happened over water. When a dud fell in the ocean, it stayed hidden forever. The results were spectacular. Anti-aircraft effectiveness jumped from roughly 2,500 shells needed per kill to just 400 shells. That's a six-fold improvement in accuracy. Japanese kamikaze pilots suddenly found their suicide missions much more dangerous, if you can call a suicide mission more dangerous than it already was. Let's not forget the bazooka, which gave ordinary foot soldiers the power to destroy tanks. Before this shoulder-fired rocket launcher, infantry faced armored vehicles with little more than harsh language and thrown rocks. The bazooka fired a 2.36-inch rocket that could penetrate tank armor from surprisingly long distances. The weapon got its nickname from a musical instrument used by comedian Bob Burns. American soldiers thought the launcher looked like Burns' homemade trombone-like contraption, so bazooka stuck. Sometimes the best names come from the most unexpected places. The Germans were so impressed they copied the design and created their own version called the Panzerschreck, which literally means tank terror. But wait, there's more weirdness coming from the German rocket program. The V-1 Buzz bomb was essentially a pilotless plane packed with explosives. It flew like a primitive cruise missile, powered by a pulse jet engine that made an unmistakable buzzing sound. Londoners learned to fear that sound, but they feared the silence even more. When the buzzing stopped, it meant the bomb was diving toward its target. These flying bombs were cheaper and easier to build than V-2 rockets, but far less accurate. Many V-1s crashed in empty fields or were shot down by fighter planes. Some British pilots discovered they could tip the flying bombs off course by carefully nudging their wings, a maneuver requiring nerves of steel and perfect timing. The anti-aircraft technology developed during WWII didn't stop evolving after 1945. Modern air defense systems still use descendants of proximity fuses and radar guidance. The Patriot missile system that defended against Iraqi Scuds during the Gulf War, direct descendant of WWII anti-aircraft research. Even today's shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons trace their lineage back to that first bazooka. The RPG-7 Javelin missile, and countless other infantry weapons all follow the same basic principle: give individual soldiers enough firepower to threaten armored vehicles. What's truly mind-bending is how these wartime innovations shaped our modern world. GPS satellites, weather prediction, space exploration, and even fireworks displays all owe something to WWII rocket technology. Every time a rocket launches from Cape Canaveral, it's carrying forward lessons learned from those terrifying V-2 attacks over London. The technology that once brought death from the sky eventually carried humanity to the stars. But before we could reach for the heavens, armies needed new ways to move across the ground, which led to some fascinating transportation breakthroughs that changed how we travel today. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the most crucial piece of equipment wasn't a tank or a bomber. It was a shallow draft boat designed by a Louisiana boat builder who'd never seen combat. Andrew Jackson Higgins created what Eisenhower later called the boat that won the war. The Higgins boat could carry 36 soldiers straight onto a beach, drop its front ramp, and let troops charge directly into battle. Before Higgins boats, amphibious landings were nightmares. Troops had to climb over the sides of regular boats in deep water, often drowning under the weight of their equipment. But these revolutionary landing craft could slide right up onto sand and gravel. The flat bottom meant they drew only 3 feet of water. More importantly, that front ramp could drop in seconds. Well, the Germans knew these boats were coming. They'd built massive concrete barriers and planted underwater obstacles to stop them. Yet over 5,000 Higgins boats still managed to deliver 160,000 Allied troops to Normandy's beaches in a single day. Without them, D-Day would have been impossible. Then there's the vehicle that became America's mechanical mascot. The Willys MB, better known as the Jeep, started as a military specification for a lightweight reconnaissance car. The army wanted something that could haul supplies, carry wounded soldiers, mount machine guns, and drive through mud that would stop a regular car cold. Willys Overland delivered exactly that. The Jeep weighed just 2,315 pounds but could carry 800 pounds of cargo. It had 4-wheel drive when most civilian cars barely had decent brakes. Ground clearance of 8.75 inches meant it could crawl over rocks that would scrape the bottom off ordinary vehicles. But here's the weird part. Nobody expected it to become a cultural icon. American GIs drove jeeps through the ruins of Berlin, across Pacific Islands, and down the Champs-Élysées when Paris was liberated. After the war, civilians wanted that same rugged capability. The Jeep became the ancestor of every SUV cruising suburban streets today. Military engineers faced another massive challenge. How do you cross a river when the enemy has blown up all the bridges? The answer came from Sir Donald Bailey, a British civil engineer who designed modular bridge sections that fit together like a giant construction set. Bailey bridges were genius in their simplicity. Each steel panel weighed 570 pounds, heavy enough to be strong, light enough for 6 men to carry. The panels bolted together without cranes or special tools. A Bailey bridge could span 200 feet and support 40-ton tanks. Even better, engineers could assemble one in under 24 hours. Field Marshal Montgomery called Bailey bridges among the most important tactical weapons of the war. When the Allies raced across Europe, they built Bailey bridges faster than the Germans could blow up the permanent ones. Some Bailey bridges built during WWII are still carrying traffic today, 75 years later. Mountain warfare presented its own transport nightmares. How do you supply troops fighting on peaks where trucks can't go and helicopters didn't exist yet? Cable cars provided the answer. Engineers strung cables across valleys and up mountainsides, creating aerial supply lines that could carry ammunition, food, and wounded soldiers. These weren't the comfortable gondolas you'd find at a ski resort. Military cable cars were bare-bones affairs, just platforms or cargo nets suspended from pulleys. But they worked. In the Italian mountains, cable cars kept Allied forces supplied during brutal winter campaigns. German mountain troops used similar systems in Norway and the Alps. The real transport workhorses, though, were the buses and trucks that kept armies moving every single day. The GMC CCKW, nicknamed Jimmy or Juice and a Half, became the backbone of Allied logistics. This 6-wheel drive truck could haul 2.5 tons of supplies almost anywhere. Over 560,000 of these trucks rolled off American assembly lines. They carried everything from gasoline to wounded soldiers. In the Pacific, they drove through jungle trails that would challenge modern 4x4s. In Europe, they delivered supplies to the front lines while artillery shells exploded nearby. These transport innovations didn't just win battles, they changed how people thought about mobility. The Jeep proved that civilian vehicles could be tough and capable. Bailey bridges showed that infrastructure could be fast and flexible. Cable cars demonstrated that geography wasn't always destiny. Makes sense, right? When you're fighting a global war, you need ways to move people and supplies across any terrain, in any weather, under enemy fire. But getting troops and equipment to the battlefield was only half the challenge. Once planes started flying higher and faster than ever before, pilots faced a deadly new enemy that had nothing to do with bullets or bombs. When you're flying at 20,000 feet, breathing becomes a problem. The air gets so thin up there that pilots would pass out without help. World War II forced aviation to solve this life or death challenge, and their solutions still keep us comfortable on every commercial flight today. The oxygen mask became essential equipment once planes started climbing higher than ever before. Early war pilots discovered that anything above 15,000 feet turned dangerous fast. Your brain starts getting foggy, your vision blurs, and eventually you black out completely. Not exactly ideal when you're dodging enemy fighters or trying to drop bombs accurately. Military engineers developed portable oxygen systems that could fit inside cramped cockpits. These weren't the simple masks you see on airliners today. They were bulky contraptions with tubes, valves, and tanks that had to work perfectly every single time. One malfunction meant certain death at high altitude. But here's where it gets interesting. The real breakthrough wasn't just oxygen masks, it was pressurized cabins. Engineers realized they could pump air into the plane's interior, creating an artificial atmosphere that felt like flying at much lower altitudes. Think of it as building a bubble of breathable air around the entire crew. The B-29 Superfortress became the first production aircraft with a fully pressurized cabin. This bomber could cruise at 30,000 feet while the crew inside felt like they were only at 8,000 feet. The technology was so advanced that it gave American bombers a huge advantage over anything else in the sky. Then there's the temperature problem that nobody talks about. Flying high means flying cold, really cold. At 25,000 feet, outside temperatures drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, or worse. Metal becomes brittle, instruments freeze up, and human skin can develop frostbite in minutes. Military designers created heated flight suits that saved countless lives during long bombing missions. These suits had electrical wiring woven throughout the fabric, powered by the aircraft's electrical system. Pilots wore heated gloves that kept their fingers nimble enough to operate controls, and heated boots that prevented frostbite in their feet. The cooling suits were equally important, though for different reasons. Fighter pilots in the Pacific Theater faced scorching heat on the ground, and during low-altitude combat, these suits circulated cold water through tubes sewn into the fabric, keeping pilots alert and preventing heat stroke during intense dogfights. What's really clever is how these inventions solved multiple problems at once. The oxygen systems didn't just help pilots breathe, they also prevented the mental confusion that comes with oxygen deprivation. Sharp thinking meant better accuracy, faster reactions, and more successful missions. Pressurized cabins did more than just provide breathable air. They allowed aircraft designers to build planes that could fly higher than enemy fighters could reach. This created a massive tactical advantage, especially for reconnaissance aircraft that needed to photograph enemy positions without getting shot down. The heating and cooling systems weren't just about comfort either. They kept critical equipment functioning properly in extreme conditions. Radio gear, navigation instruments, and weapons systems all performed better when they weren't freezing or overheating. Military medical teams discovered that altitude sickness affected different people in different ways. Some pilots could handle 18,000 feet without oxygen, while others got dizzy at 12,000 feet. This led to standardized oxygen requirements that didn't leave anything to chance. Emergency oxygen bottles became standard equipment on every aircraft. If the main system failed, pilots had backup bottles that could keep them alive long enough to descend to breathable altitudes. These bottles were small, lightweight, and absolutely crucial for survival. The war also produced advances in oxygen concentration technology. Instead of carrying heavy tanks of pure oxygen, some aircraft used systems that concentrated oxygen from outside air. This reduced weight and gave planes longer range and reach, critical advantages in long-distance missions over the Pacific. Let's not forget the practical details that made everything work. Oxygen masks had to seal properly around pilot faces, even when pulling high G-forces during combat maneuvers. The tubes and connections had to stay secure when pilots were thrown around in their seats. Every component needed to function flawlessly in conditions that would destroy civilian equipment. Fighter pilots developed techniques for managing their oxygen systems during combat. They learned to control their breathing during high-stress situations, making their oxygen supply last longer. Some pilots even used oxygen flow as a way to stay calm and focused during intense battles. The knowledge gained from wartime aviation created the foundation for modern commercial flight. Every pressurized airliner, every oxygen mask demonstration, every climate control system traces its roots back to these wartime innovations. But the war produced another category of crucial equipment that kept pilots safe in completely different ways. When darkness fell, fighting continued, and that required a whole new set of technological solutions that most people never knew existed. When darkness fell during World War II, most armies became nearly blind. Fighting at night was like playing chess with a blindfold on. But some clever engineers had different ideas about how to change that game entirely. The Germans developed something that sounds like science fiction for 1943, infrared rifle scopes. These devices could detect heat signatures from enemy soldiers hiding in complete darkness. The technology was massive, requiring a heavy battery pack that soldiers had to carry on their backs. But here's the wild part: it actually worked. German snipers could spot Allied troops from over 400 yards away on moonless nights. The device was called Vampire, which is pretty fitting when you think about hunting in the dark. Well, the Allies weren't going to let that slide without a response. British engineers created their own infrared systems, but they took a different approach. Instead of making portable sniper scopes, they mounted infrared searchlights on tanks. These invisible beams could illuminate enemy positions without giving away their own location to the naked eye. Tank crews could see everything while remaining completely hidden themselves. But infrared wasn't the only night fighting innovation that changed everything. Cities across Europe and Britain had to protect themselves from nighttime bombing raids. The solution: blackout curtains that became mandatory in every home and building. These weren't just regular thick curtains either. They were specially designed with multiple layers and reflective backing to prevent even the tiniest sliver of light from escaping. Air raid wardens would patrol neighborhoods, shouting at anyone whose windows showed even a pinhole of light. The phrase, Put that light out became as common as good morning. Then there's the genius of hand-cranked flashlights. Batteries were precious during wartime, needed for radios and other critical equipment. Someone figured out that a small hand generator could power a flashlight indefinitely. Soldiers would crank a handle for 30 seconds to get several minutes of bright light. No batteries required, ever. These devices were incredibly reliable. Some of them still work perfectly today, nearly 80 years later. Let's not forget one of the most creative solutions for nighttime navigation. Engineers developed glow-in-the-dark paint using radium and phosphorus compounds. This paint absorbed sunlight during the day and glowed green for hours after sunset. They painted it on aircraft landing strips, ship railings, and even weapon sights. Pilots could find their runways in complete darkness without using any lights that might attract enemy bombers. The paint was brilliant, except for one tiny detail they didn't fully understand yet. Radium was radioactive. Many of the workers who applied this paint later developed serious health problems. Aircraft carriers faced a particularly tricky challenge with night operations. How do you land a plane on a moving ship in total darkness? The Navy came up with colored light systems that only pilots with special filters could see. Red lights marked the landing area, but they were dimmed so low that enemy submarines couldn't spot them from more than a few hundred yards away. Pilots wore red-tinted goggles that made these lights appear much brighter while preserving their night vision. The weird part is how these inventions accidentally improved everyday life after the war. Those hand-crank flashlights became camping essentials. Emergency workers still use them today because they never run out of power. Blackout curtains evolved into energy-efficient window treatments that help people sleep better and reduce heating costs. Even the infrared technology found its way into everything from television remote controls to medical devices. Enemy planes really did have trouble spotting hidden targets after sunset, just like the military planners hoped. But the cat-and-mouse game of nighttime warfare pushed both sides to develop increasingly sophisticated detection methods. Some German bombers started using early forms of radar to find targets in complete darkness. The Allies responded by creating dummy cities with fake lights to confuse incoming raiders. Night fighting equipment also changed how soldiers thought about time itself. Before these inventions, armies mostly stopped fighting when the sun went down. Darkness meant rest, planning, and waiting for dawn. Suddenly the war could continue around the clock. Sleep became a luxury rather than a natural part of the daily rhythm. The most successful night fighting innovation might have been the simplest one: better training. Soldiers learned to move silently, communicate without sound, and navigate by feeling their way through terrain. They discovered that the human eye could adapt to darkness much better than anyone previously believed, if you just gave it enough time and practice. But while soldiers were learning to fight in the dark, engineers back home were working on an entirely different problem. How do you power all this new electronic equipment when you're miles away from the nearest electrical outlet? The answer would revolutionize not just warfare, but eventually change how we think about energy itself. When your radio dies in the middle of nowhere, you're basically toast. WWII soldiers figured this out the hard way during their first few battles. Dead batteries meant dead communication, and dead communication often meant dead soldiers. But here's where military engineers got creative. They started building power sources that didn't depend on finding the nearest electrical outlet. Hand-cranked radios became the backbone of field communication. These weren't your grandmother's music boxes with cute little handles. We're talking about serious mechanical engineering packed into portable cases. A few minutes of vigorous cranking could power a radio for hours of transmission. The beauty? No batteries required, no power grid needed. Just good old-fashioned elbow grease. Soldiers in remote Pacific islands and European forests could stay connected to command headquarters without worrying about their equipment dying at the worst possible moment. Then there's the portable generator revolution that nobody talks about enough. Before WWII, generators were massive industrial machines that required trucks to move around. Military necessity forced engineers to shrink these power plants down to something a small team could carry. The first truly portable generators weighed about 200 pounds heavy by today's standards, but revolutionary for 1943. These compact powerhouses could light up field hospitals, charge communication equipment, and run essential electronics miles away from civilization. Battery technology took a massive leap forward too. The compact battery packs developed for walkie-talkies were engineering marvels of their time. Engineers had to figure out how to store maximum electrical energy in minimum space while making batteries tough enough to survive combat conditions. Getting dropped, soaked in mud, frozen in winter trenches, or baked under desert sun. Military batteries had to handle everything nature and warfare could throw at them. But the real genius showed up in battery recharging systems. Military camps couldn't exactly plug into wall sockets, so engineers created overnight charging stations powered by those portable generators. Picture this setup: generators running through the night, quietly humming while dozens of radio batteries and searchlight power packs recharged for the next day's operations. This might sound simple now, but in the 1940s, creating reliable off-grid electrical infrastructure was cutting-edge technology. Remote outposts presented the biggest power challenges. Imagine being stationed on a tiny Pacific island, hundreds of miles from the nearest supply ship. Your survival depends on radio contact with headquarters, but your batteries are running low. Hand-cranked equipment became literally life-saving technology in these situations. Radio operators developed impressive arm muscles from constant cranking, but they stayed alive and connected to the outside world. Arctic conditions pushed portable power technology to its absolute limits. Regular batteries died quickly in extreme cold, so engineers developed specialized cold-weather power sources. Some used body heat to maintain battery temperature, while others incorporated chemical heating elements. The solutions weren't always elegant, but they worked when failure meant freezing to death in isolation. Let's not forget the ingenious backup systems military engineers built into everything. Primary battery dies, switch to the backup. Backup battery fails, start cranking the manual generator. Generator breaks, pull out the emergency hand crank radio. This redundancy thinking influenced how we design critical systems today. Always have a backup for your backup. The weirdest power innovations came from desperate necessity. Soldiers rigged bicycle wheels to generate electricity through pedaling. Others used windmills made from aircraft propellers to charge batteries in consistently windy locations. Water wheels powered equipment near streams and rivers. Our military camps became testing grounds for every possible way to generate portable electricity. Searchlight operations required serious battery power. These massive beams could illuminate enemy aircraft or guide friendly planes to landing strips, but they drained conventional batteries in minutes. Engineers developed high-capacity battery packs specifically for searchlights, creating power systems that could run bright lights for hours without recharging. Communication networks relied entirely on portable power reliability. A single dead radio could break the chain of command across entire battle zones. Military planners learned to treat portable power as seriously as ammunition supply. Without reliable electrical systems, modern warfare simply couldn't function effectively. The reliability standards developed during WWII still influence portable power design today. Military equipment had to work the first time, every time, regardless of conditions. This zero-tolerance approach to failure pushed engineers to create more robust, dependable power systems than civilian applications ever demanded. Remote radar stations needed constant electrical power to detect incoming enemy aircraft. These early warning systems operated in isolated locations where power failures meant surprise attacks. Portable generators and battery backup systems kept radar dishes spinning and radio transmitters broadcasting vital intelligence. Military workshops developed surprisingly sophisticated power management techniques. They learned to balance generator loads, optimize battery charging cycles, and extend equipment runtime through careful electrical conservation. These power management strategies later influenced everything from camping gear to emergency preparedness systems. Of course, all this portable power innovation would prove essential for another crucial wartime necessity: keeping soldiers and equipment clean and healthy in impossible conditions. When soldiers march through jungles or set up camps near questionable water sources, staying alive becomes a chemistry problem. World War II forced armies to solve this puzzle fast, creating innovations that still keep us healthy today. The simplest breakthrough saved countless lives without anyone realizing it. Chlorine tablets. Drop one tiny pill into a canteen of murky river water, wait 30 minutes, and deadly bacteria vanish. These tablets worked so well that soldiers could drink from almost any water source without getting sick. The US Army distributed millions of these tablets, and suddenly troops could venture deeper into enemy territory without worrying about finding clean streams. What's fascinating is how basic the science was. Chlorine had been used in swimming pools for years, but nobody thought to make it portable until the war demanded it. Then there's the filtering story that sounds almost too simple to believe. Engineers created compact water filters using layers of sand, charcoal, and cloth. Nothing fancy, nothing electronic, just materials you could find almost anywhere, packed into metal containers, small enough to fit in a backpack. These filters removed dirt, debris, and most harmful particles from any water source. Soldiers in the Pacific Theater used them constantly, turning swamp water into something drinkable. The weird part is how effective they were. Some of these basic filters cleaned water better than expensive systems used in cities back home. But water wasn't the only deadly threat floating around battlefields. Poison gas attacks terrified everyone, leading to one of the war's most crucial inventions: improved gas masks that actually worked. Earlier gas masks were clunky, uncomfortable, and often leaked at the worst possible times. World War II versions used new rubber compounds and better sealing systems. The filters inside contained activated charcoal and special chemicals that neutralized different types of poison gases. Soldiers could wear them for hours without suffocating, and they provided real protection instead of just psychological comfort. These masks were so effective that both sides hesitated to use chemical weapons, knowing the other side could defend against them. Let's not forget the air quality problems that nobody talks about in war movies. Bunkers, submarines, and underground command centers became death traps without proper ventilation. Hundreds of people crammed into sealed spaces created dangerous carbon dioxide levels and humidity that could kill equipment faster than enemy bombs. Mobile air filtration systems solved this crisis. These machines, roughly the size of refrigerators, could scrub the air in enclosed spaces and keep everyone breathing safely. They removed moisture, filtered out dust and smoke, and circulated fresh air even when outside conditions were toxic. Submarine crews especially depended on these systems during long underwater missions. Without them, subs would have been floating coffins instead of effective weapons. The engineering behind these air purifiers was surprisingly advanced. They used rotating fans, chemical scrubbers, and moisture-absorbing materials that automatically regenerated themselves. Some versions even included heating elements to prevent freezing in cold climates. Military engineers essentially created the first portable climate control systems, decades before anyone thought about air conditioning for homes. Dehumidifiers became secret weapons against equipment failure. Moisture destroyed radio equipment, ruined ammunition, and caused weapons to jam at critical moments. Portable dehumidifiers kept command centers and supply bunkers dry enough to preserve vital gear. These machines were so important that repair teams carried spare parts for them everywhere, treating them like essential weapons rather than luxury items. The most impressive part about these innovations was their simplicity. No computer chips, no complex electronics, just smart engineering using available materials. Chlorine tablets cost pennies to produce. Water filters used sand and charcoal. Gas masks relied on rubber and activated carbon. Air purification systems used fans and basic chemistry. Yet these simple inventions saved more lives than many fancy weapons. Disease and contamination killed more soldiers than bullets in previous wars, but World War II changed that equation completely. Armies could operate in jungles, deserts, swamps, and frozen wastelands because they solved the basic problems of clean water and breathable air. After the war ended, these technologies didn't disappear into military storage. Water purification tablets became standard equipment for hikers, campers, and emergency responders. Modern water filters still use the same basic principles developed for soldiers. Gas mask technology evolved into respiratory protection for firefighters, factory workers, and medical personnel. Air purification systems became the foundation for modern HVAC systems in buildings everywhere. The strangest legacy might be how these wartime necessities became invisible parts of daily life. Every time you drink filtered water, breathe clean air in a building, or see someone wearing protective breathing equipment, you're witnessing the descendants of battlefield innovations created under pressure. Speaking of pressure and innovation, the war also demanded new ways to see and understand enemy territory from above, leading to some remarkable advances in aerial reconnaissance that changed how we map our world. Look, when most people think about World War II intelligence, they imagine spies sneaking around with tiny cameras. But the real game changer happened thousands of feet above enemy territory. Aerial photography during the war became so advanced that it basically invented modern surveillance. We're talking about cameras that could spot a cigarette pack from 2 miles up. The story starts with something called the F-52 camera, mounted in the belly of reconnaissance planes. This beast weighed over 600 pounds and shot film at incredible speeds. Pilots flying these missions weren't your typical fighter jocks either. They needed steady hands because one blurry photo could mean the difference between a successful bombing run and complete disaster. Then there's the wild part about photo interpretation. The military created entire schools just to teach people how to read these aerial shots. Students spent months learning to identify tank tracks, camouflaged bunkers, and even fresh laundry hanging outside enemy camps. Fresh laundry meant troops were still there. Genius, right? But here's where it gets really interesting. The interpreters developed techniques so precise they could tell whether a building was occupied just by looking at wear patterns on pathways. Heavy foot traffic created specific shadows and soil compression that showed up on high-quality film. Some interpreters became so skilled they could spot newly dug graves, which revealed casualty numbers without ever setting foot on enemy soil. Weather balloons played a massive role too, though most people overlook this connection. These balloons carried meteorological instruments that helped predict wind patterns, cloud cover, and visibility conditions. Accurate weather data meant photo reconnaissance missions could be timed perfectly. No point sending expensive planes and risking pilots' lives if clouds would block the camera's view. The German Luftwaffe had their own aerial photography program, and they were terrifyingly good at it. Their cameras used special film that worked in extreme cold, crucial for high-altitude missions over Britain and Russia. German photo analysts created detailed maps of Allied positions, harbor defenses, and factory locations. Some of these maps were so accurate that post-war investigators found them more detailed than official government surveys. Let's not forget the technical breakthrough that made it all possible: gyroscopic camera mounts. These devices kept cameras steady even when planes hit turbulence or took evasive action. Before gyroscopic stabilization, most aerial photos came out blurred and useless. The mount technology was so revolutionary that modern helicopter news cameras still use similar principles. Processing these photos required portable darkrooms that could be set up anywhere. Military units developed chemical solutions that worked in extreme temperatures from desert heat to Arctic cold. Photo technicians often worked in makeshift labs inside tents, developing film while bombs fell nearby. The urgency was incredible because fresh intelligence could change battle plans within hours. American forces took aerial photography to another level with something called mosaic mapping. They would take hundreds of overlapping photos of the same area, then piece them together like a jigsaw puzzle. The result was incredibly detailed maps that showed every building, road, and defensive position across entire regions. These mosaics helped plan D-Day landings and Pacific Island assaults. The speed of photo analysis became crucial as the war progressed. Intelligence teams needed to process thousands of images daily, looking for changes in enemy positions, new construction, or troop movements. They developed systematic approaches with different specialists focusing on specific types of targets. One person might only look for aircraft, another for ships, and another for railroad activity. Here's something that sounds like science fiction but was completely real: stereophotography. Special cameras took paired images from slightly different angles, creating three-dimensional effects when viewed through special equipment. This technique revealed the height of buildings, depth of bunkers, and even the thickness of armor on enemy tanks. Military planners could virtually walk through enemy territory before attacks. The most dangerous photography missions happened at night using flash bombs. Planes would fly over targets and drop massive flashes that illuminated entire cities for split seconds. The timing had to be perfect, because photographers got only one chance before enemy fighters scrambled to intercept. These night missions provided crucial intelligence about blackout effectiveness and nocturnal military activity. British intelligence developed mobile photo interpretation units that traveled with advancing armies. These teams could analyze fresh aerial photos and brief ground commanders within hours of missions returning. The speed of intelligence processing often determined which units advanced and which waited for better opportunities. What's remarkable is how these wartime innovations laid the groundwork for modern satellite surveillance. The same principles of high-altitude photography, image stabilization, and rapid analysis became the foundation for space-based intelligence gathering during the Cold War. All this aerial detective work connects directly to another crucial wartime communication breakthrough that kept those intelligence reports flowing between units scattered across multiple continents. Talking across a battlefield used to mean screaming over gunfire or sending runners between trenches. Both methods had obvious problems. Screaming gave away your position to snipers, and runners had a nasty habit of getting shot before delivering their messages. Everything changed when engineers figured out how to make radios small enough for soldiers to carry. The walkie-talkie was born from pure desperation. Infantry units were getting slaughtered because they couldn't coordinate attacks or call for backup when things went sideways. The first field radios weighed about as much as a small refrigerator. Soldiers called them backbreakers because carrying one meant you'd probably collapse before reaching the front lines. But engineers kept shrinking the technology. By 1943, American troops had handheld radios that could reach other units several miles away. These weren't the toy walkie-talkies kids play with today. Military versions used frequency modulation to cut through interference from tank engines, artillery blasts, and enemy jamming attempts. The range varied wildly depending on terrain, but squads could finally talk to each other over hills and through forests without stringing telephone wires everywhere. Then there's the fascinating story of code talkers. The Navajo language became one of America's most effective secret weapons because it was virtually impossible for enemy cryptographers to crack. Japanese intelligence officers could intercept radio transmissions all day long, but they had zero chance of understanding what Daiba Hiezibi Yiltsanen meant in the middle of a battle plan. The Navajo code talkers created their own military vocabulary since traditional Navajo had no words for submarine or bomber. They called submarines iron fish and bombers buzzard. The system was so secure that even other Native American soldiers couldn't understand it without specific training. Makes sense, right? Different tribes spoke completely different languages. Well, radio communication had another massive advantage nobody talks about enough. Officers could finally give real-time updates during battles instead of relying on outdated information. Before portable radios, commanders made decisions based on reports that were often hours old. By the time reinforcements arrived, the entire situation had usually changed. Morse code also got a major upgrade during the war. Telegraph operators learned to transmit at incredible speeds using portable equipment that fit in backpacks. Some could tap out 30 words per minute in perfect code while under heavy fire. These guys developed almost supernatural hearing abilities, recognizing individual operators by their unique tapping rhythms. But the real breakthrough was extending radio range far beyond line-of-sight limitations. Engineers discovered that certain radio frequencies could bounce off the atmosphere and travel hundreds of miles. This meant submarines could communicate with headquarters from the middle of the ocean, and bomber crews could radio their positions from deep behind enemy lines. Field radios became so reliable that every single squad started carrying them by 1944. Infantry, tank crews, pilots, and artillery units all stayed in constant contact during major operations. D-Day succeeded partly because thousands of Allied soldiers could coordinate their movements in real time across multiple beaches simultaneously. And the weird part is how quickly soldiers adapted to radio discipline. Everyone had to learn proper call signs, communication protocols, and emergency procedures. Speaking too long on one frequency could let enemy direction-finding equipment locate your position. Smart operators kept transmissions short and sweet. Radio technology also solved the nightmare of friendly fire incidents. Tank crews could finally identify other Allied vehicles before shooting at them. Fighter pilots could verify targets with ground controllers instead of attacking anything that moved. The number of accidental casualties dropped dramatically once reliable communication became standard. Japanese forces developed their own innovative communication systems, but they faced serious disadvantages. Their radio equipment was often inferior to Allied technology, and their rigid command structure made flexible communication difficult. Lower-ranking soldiers weren't allowed to make independent decisions, even when radio contact with officers was impossible. German radio technology was actually quite advanced, but they made crucial strategic mistakes. Their operators often transmitted too long, giving Allied direction-finding teams enough time to pinpoint German positions. Many successful bombing raids happened because intercepted radio chatter revealed enemy supply depots and troop movements. Portable generators became essential for keeping radio batteries charged in remote locations. Engineers designed hand-cranked charging systems that worked without fuel or electricity. Soldiers learned to take turns cranking generators while others maintained radio watch throughout the night. The transformation was remarkable. Armies that had relied on drums, flags, and messenger pigeons for thousands of years suddenly had instant voice communication across vast distances. Military tactics changed forever because commanders could respond to developing situations within minutes instead of hours. These wartime radio innovations laid the groundwork for everything from cell phones to satellite communications. But there's another invention from this era that completely revolutionized how we build things. The story of prefabricated construction might surprise you. When you're at war, waiting weeks for a bridge isn't an option. Bombs destroy infrastructure faster than traditional construction crews can rebuild it. Engineers needed solutions that worked in hours, not months. The pressure created some of the most ingenious quick-build innovations in human history. Bailey bridges changed everything about temporary construction. Named after Donald Bailey, these modular marvels could span rivers, valleys, or bomb craters in record time. Each section weighed just enough for 6 soldiers to carry, yet when assembled they could support tanks weighing 40 tons. The genius wasn't in the materials, it was in the design. Picture trying to build a bridge while enemy artillery shells whistle overhead. Traditional bridge construction required heavy machinery, concrete foundations and weeks of work. Bailey bridges used a completely different approach. Standardized steel panels connected with pins and bolts. No welding, no concrete, no complicated tools. Just clever engineering that let ordinary soldiers become bridge builders. The speed was incredible. A Bailey bridge spanning 200 feet could be assembled in under 24 hours by a trained crew. During the Italian campaign, engineers threw up Bailey bridges so fast that advancing troops barely slowed down. Some bridges went up overnight, allowing tanks to cross by dawn. The Germans couldn't believe how quickly Allied forces appeared on their side of destroyed crossings. Then there's the story of prefabricated buildings that revolutionized military housing. Before WWII, setting up a base meant weeks of construction using local materials. Troops lived in tents while carpenters slowly built barracks. The military needed something faster, cheaper, and more practical. Enter the Quonset hut, perhaps the most recognizable quick-build structure ever created. These half-cylinder buildings shipped completely flat in standard cargo containers. Once delivered, a small crew could assemble an entire Quonset hut in a single day. The corrugated steel design was both lightweight and incredibly strong. The beauty of Quonset huts lay in their versatility. Need a mess hall, assemble 3 huts end to end. Want storage, put up a hut in 2 hours. Hospital, line up several huts and cut connecting doorways. By 1946, over 170,000 Quonset huts had been manufactured. They housed millions of soldiers across every theater of war. But here's where it gets interesting. Mobile runways pushed quick construction into entirely new territory. Landing strips traditionally took months to build, grading land, laying concrete, installing drainage systems. Fighter planes needed somewhere to land, and they needed it fast as front lines shifted. Pierced steel planking, or PSP, solved this problem brilliantly. These interlocking steel plates could turn any reasonably flat field into an operational runway within days. Each plank weighed about 66 pounds and connected to its neighbors through simple hooks and slots. Engineers could lay PSP over sand, mud, or rough ground. The real test came during the Pacific Island campaigns. Engineers would hit the beach alongside combat troops, then immediately start laying PSP runways while battles raged nearby. Within 72 hours of landing, fighter planes were taking off from airstrips that didn't exist 3 days earlier. Japanese forces couldn't understand how American air power appeared so quickly on captured islands. Well, the speed of wartime construction wasn't just about clever designs, it was about rethinking the entire building process. Traditional construction followed a linear sequence: foundation, framing, walls, roof, finishing. Wartime builders threw that sequence out the window. Prefabrication moved much of the work to factories back home. While battles raged overseas, American factories mass-produced building components using assembly line techniques. Walls arrived with electrical wiring already installed. Floor sections came with plumbing built in. Roof panels shipped with insulation attached. The psychological impact was huge too. Troops who could quickly build decent shelter fought better than soldiers stuck in muddy foxholes. A Quonset hut wasn't luxury, but it beat sleeping in the rain. Quick bridges meant supplies reached the front faster, keeping morale high. Military engineers learned to think like factory managers, standardize everything, use identical components that work together, train crews to specialize in specific assembly tasks, keep spare parts interchangeable across different structures. And the weird part is how these wartime innovations quietly revolutionized civilian construction after 1945. Building contractors discovered that prefabrication could cut costs and construction time for regular houses. The post-war housing boom relied heavily on techniques developed for military quick-build projects. Bailey Bridge principles influenced highway overpasses and emergency bridges worldwide. Quonset hut designs evolved into modern prefab buildings, storage facilities, and even trendy restaurants. Mobile runway technology became the foundation for temporary helicopter pads and emergency landing strips. Construction crews today still use PSP-style systems for temporary roads, event flooring, and disaster relief projects. The basic idea, standardized interlocking panels that create instant infrastructure, proves useful far beyond military applications. These quick-build innovations saved countless lives by getting critical infrastructure operational fast. But beyond the immediate military benefits, they fundamentally changed how people think about construction itself. Sometimes the best solutions come from having absolutely no time to waste. Speaking of life-saving innovations born from desperate circumstances, some of the war's most crucial survival tools came from completely unexpected places. When your plane gets shot down over the Pacific Ocean, you've got about 3 minutes before hypothermia starts setting in. 3 minutes to figure out if you're going to live or die. WWII pilots knew this brutal math by heart, which is why the military spent serious money developing gear that could keep a human being alive in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Personal life rafts became every pilot's best friend. These weren't your typical pool floaties. They were engineered survival pods that could inflate in seconds using CO2 cartridges. The bright yellow rubber could be spotted from miles away by rescue planes, and the interior held enough supplies for a week at sea. Some rafts even came with small sails because drifting aimlessly wasn't exactly a solid survival strategy. But here's where things get interesting. The military didn't just want pilots to float around hoping someone would find them. Emergency beacons changed the entire rescue game. These battery-powered transmitters sent out radio signals that rescue teams could track from hundreds of miles away. The technology was so revolutionary that downed airmen went from being needles in haystacks to broadcasting their exact location 24 hours a day. Then there's the gear that sounds almost too convenient to be real. Inflatable tents that popped up in minutes gave survivors actual shelter instead of just exposure to the elements. These weren't flimsy camping equipment either. They were designed to withstand serious weather while weighing almost nothing. The secret was in the material's lightweight fabrics that could be compressed down to the size of a small backpack but expanded into full-sized shelters when needed. Compass wristwatches solved another critical problem. Getting rescued doesn't help much if you're walking in circles. These timepieces had built-in compasses that worked even when everything else failed. The watches were shock-resistant, waterproof, and designed to keep running after surviving plane crashes. Military engineers knew that in survival situations, knowing which direction is north could mean the difference between reaching safety and wandering until you collapse. Let's not forget the survival kits themselves, which were basically concentrated hope packed into small containers. Each kit contained fishing line and hooks, because oceans are full of food if you know how to catch it. Fire starters that worked even when soaking wet gave survivors the ability to signal for help or stay warm during cold nights. And chocolate bars weren't just morale boosters, they were calculated sources of quick energy that wouldn't spoil in extreme temperatures. The fishing gear deserves special attention. Military nutritionists figured out that a person could survive almost indefinitely near water if they could catch fish. The fishing line was incredibly strong for its thickness, and the hooks were designed to catch multiple species. Some kits even included small nets that could be used for catching larger quantities of smaller fish. Makes sense when you consider that rescue might take days or weeks. Fire starters went way beyond simple matches. These chemical compounds could ignite even after being underwater, which sounds impossible until you realize that standard matches become useless the moment they get damp. The military version used magnesium and other materials that created intense heat regardless of weather conditions. Starting a fire on a life raft in the middle of a storm became totally doable, but the chocolate reveals something fascinating about survival psychology. Military researchers discovered that maintaining morale was just as important as maintaining calorie intake. Soldiers who believed they might survive were far more likely to actually survive. Chocolate provided both sugar for immediate energy and a small psychological boost during the worst moments. It's weird how something as simple as familiar taste could keep someone fighting to stay alive. The really clever part was how everything worked together. The beacon called for help while the raft kept you afloat, and the tent provided shelter. The compass guided you toward rescue while the fishing gear sustained you during the wait. The fire starter created signals and warmth, while the chocolate maintained both your blood sugar and your will to keep going. Every piece had multiple purposes because when you're carrying survival gear into combat, every ounce matters. Emergency preparedness became a complete science during the war. Engineers studied exactly how long humans could survive in different conditions and designed equipment to extend those time limits as much as possible. They tested gear in Arctic conditions, tropical heat, and ocean storms to make sure it would work when lives depended on it. These survival innovations didn't just save pilots and sailors during the war, the same principles influence modern emergency preparedness, camping equipment, and even space exploration gear. Every time someone packs an emergency kit or designs equipment for extreme conditions, they're building on lessons learned from keeping people alive in the most desperate situations imaginable. While survival gear kept people alive in emergencies, another wartime invention was busy entertaining children back home, and it started with something as simple as a spring that wouldn't stay put. A Navy engineer was testing springs for battleship equipment in 1943 when he accidentally knocked one off his workbench. Instead of just hitting the floor like any normal spring would, this particular coil started walking down a stack of books, then continued across the floor in that weird end-over-end motion. Richard James watched this happen and had one of those light bulb moments that changes everything. The spring wasn't supposed to do that. James had been working on springs designed to keep sensitive naval instruments steady during rough seas. Battleships rocked violently in storms and delicate gauges needed stabilization to give accurate readings. But this dropped spring seemed to have a mind of its own, moving with an almost hypnotic rhythm that defied expectations. Well, James couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen. He went home and told his wife Betty about the walking spring. She wasn't immediately impressed. Her husband brought home plenty of failed experiments, but Richard kept tinkering with different spring tensions and materials, trying to recreate that perfect walking motion he'd witnessed in his lab. The weird part is how this military stabilization project turned into something completely different. James discovered that the spring's walking ability had nothing to do with its original naval purpose. The very characteristic that made it useless for ship equipment, its tendency to move when disturbed, became its greatest strength as something else entirely. Betty James deserves credit for seeing the bigger picture. She suggested they could market this walking spring as a toy. The couple spent months perfecting the design, testing different metals and coil tensions. They needed a spring that would walk smoothly downstairs without getting tangled or losing momentum halfway down. Then there's the naming challenge they faced. What do you call a spring that walks? Betty came up with slinky after flipping through the dictionary and finding the word that meant sleek and graceful. Makes sense, right? The spring did have an oddly elegant way of moving despite being just a simple coil of metal. James borrowed $500 to have the first batch of slinkies manufactured. That's roughly $7,000 in today's money, a serious investment for a family during wartime. The couple had no idea if anyone would actually buy a walking spring, especially with more pressing concerns like rationing and war news dominating daily life. The first sales test happened at Gimbel's department store in Philadelphia in November 1945, just months after the war ended. James was nervous about the demonstration. What if people thought a walking spring was stupid? What if kids weren't interested in such a simple toy after being entertained by war stories and victory parades? His worries vanished quickly. The first 400 slinkies sold out in 90 minutes. Customers couldn't get enough of watching the spring walk downstairs, flowing from step to step with that mesmerizing rhythm. Parents bought them for their children, but plenty of adults found themselves playing with slinkies too. But why did a simple spring become such a phenomenon? The answer reveals something interesting about human psychology. After years of complex wartime technology and serious adult concerns, people craved something beautifully simple. A slinky required no batteries, no instructions, no assembly. You just set it at the top of some stairs and watched physics do its work. The toy also arrived at the perfect historical moment. American families had extra spending money from wartime work, and they were ready to spoil their children after years of rationing and sacrifice. The slinky represented pure fun with no educational pretense or moral lesson attached. It was delightfully pointless, which made it perfect. James probably never imagined his naval stabilization spring would outlast most of the battleships it was originally designed to help. The military connection faded into history, but the slinky kept walking downstairs in homes around the world. The same physics that made it unsuitable for ship instruments made it irresistible as a plaything. And the business side. The James family company eventually sold over 250 million slinkies worldwide. That's 250 million springs walking downstairs, entertaining children and adults across multiple generations. Not bad for an accidental discovery in a Navy lab. The slinky story perfectly captures how wartime innovation often produced unexpected civilian benefits. An engineer trying to solve a serious military problem created one of the most enduring toys in history. The failure of one project became the spectacular success of another. Richard James had been focused on keeping battleship equipment stable during storms at sea. Instead, he gave the world something that brings joy through controlled instability, a spring that moves with purpose and grace. Sometimes the best discoveries happen when we're looking for something completely different. Speaking of wartime innovations that transformed civilian life, the laboratory breakthroughs in food science were creating changes that would revolutionize how families ate long after the fighting stopped. You know how soldiers always joke about army food tasting like cardboard? Well, during World War II, scientists were desperately trying to make that cardboard taste better. But here's the twist. Their experiments didn't just change what troops ate. They accidentally revolutionized how the entire world grows, preserves, and serves food. The story starts in fields across America, where farmers faced a massive problem. Millions of young men had left for war, leaving crops unattended. Enter the crop duster, originally designed to spray insecticides from low-flying planes. These aerial sprayers could cover hundreds of acres in hours, doing the work of dozens of farmhands. The weird part is, pilots flying these missions often got so dizzy from the chemicals that they'd land and immediately throw up. But it worked. Food production actually increased during the war, despite having fewer people to work the land. Then there's the freezing revolution that nobody talks about. Clarence Birdseye had been experimenting with quick freezing techniques since the 1920s, but the war made his methods absolutely essential. Military scientists discovered that flash freezing food at extremely low temperatures, we're talking minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, kept vegetables fresh for months. The key was speed. Slow freezing created large ice crystals that destroyed cell walls, turning carrots into mush. Fast freezing created tiny crystals that preserved texture and nutrition. Suddenly, troops in the Pacific could eat corn from Iowa that tasted like it was picked yesterday. But let's not forget the chemistry experiment happening in every mess tent. Synthetic fertilizers became crucial when traditional sources got cut off. Before the war, much of America's fertilizer came from Chile. When shipping lanes became dangerous, chemists had to get creative. They figured out how to pull nitrogen straight from the air using the Haber-Bosch process on an industrial scale. This wasn't just about feeding soldiers, entire populations were at risk of starvation. The same factories making explosives could switch to producing fertilizer. Nitrogen compounds that blew up bridges could also grow bigger potatoes. Makes sense, right? The real game changer was happening in tiny portable stoves that could cook a meal anywhere. These weren't your typical camping equipment. Engineers designed compact burners that worked in freezing trenches, tropical jungles, and even inside cramped submarine compartments. Some used alcohol fuel, others burned solid fuel tablets that looked like large aspirin. The brilliant part was the heat efficiency. These stoves could boil water in under 3 minutes while using minimal fuel. Soldiers could have hot coffee even when pinned down by enemy fire. Well, the packaging innovations were equally revolutionary. Scientists developed waterproof containers that could survive being dropped from planes or submerged in salt water for days. They created the ancestor of modern vacuum-sealed bags using materials that didn't exist before 1940. Food could be compressed to half its normal size without losing nutritional value. A week's worth of meals fit in a space smaller than a shoebox. And the weird part is how these military experiments accidentally created the foundation for fast food. Dehydration techniques meant mashed potatoes could be turned into powder, then reconstituted with hot water. Meat could be processed, seasoned and shaped into patties that cooked uniformly every single time. The mass production methods needed to feed millions of soldiers taught manufacturers how to make identical products at incredible speed. But why stop there? Scientists were also working on synthetic vitamins to prevent diseases like scurvy and beriberi in troops stationed far from fresh food sources. They discovered how to concentrate vitamin C into tiny tablets and fortify foods with nutrients that would normally disappear during preservation. This wasn't just convenient, it was literally keeping armies healthy enough to fight. The really surprising development was in food preservation without refrigeration. Researchers found ways to remove oxygen from containers, creating environments where bacteria couldn't survive. They developed chemical preservatives that extended shelf life from days to months. Some of these techniques came from studying how ancient civilizations preserved food, then applying modern chemistry to improve the process. Then there's the unintended consequence that changed everything. When the war ended, all these innovations needed somewhere to go. Factories that had been making K-rations suddenly pivoted to TV dinners. Techniques for dehydrating vegetables became instant soup mixes. Equipment designed for field kitchens found its way into restaurant chains that could serve hundreds of customers with military-like efficiency. The timing couldn't have been better. Returning soldiers had experienced foods and flavors from around the world. They wanted convenience but also variety. The technology existed to give them both. Companies like McDonald's and KFC built their empires using mass production techniques perfected in wartime mess halls. But here's what most people miss. The real innovation wasn't just in making food last longer or cook faster, it was in understanding food as a system. Military planners had to consider nutrition, storage, transportation, preparation, and morale all at once. This holistic approach to food science didn't disappear when peace returned. Speaking of things that didn't disappear, the scientists and engineers behind these breakthroughs were already working on their next challenge, creating technologies that would define the post-war world in ways nobody could predict. World War II didn't just end with victory parades and soldiers coming home. The real victory happened decades later, in ways nobody saw coming. Those desperate wartime inventions, they quietly snuck into every corner of our lives. Walk up to any ATM today and you're using ideas born from wartime bank security. During the war, banks needed foolproof ways to verify identity and protect money from sabotage. The mechanical systems they developed for secure transactions became the foundation for automated banking. What started as protection against enemy spies turned into your ability to grab cash at 2 a.m. But here's where it gets really interesting. Those early satellites everyone thinks started the space race. Wrong. They actually traced their roots back to classified spy projects that began before the war even ended. Military engineers realized that if you could launch a rocket high enough, you could watch everything happening on the ground below. The technology jump from V-2 rockets to spy satellites happened faster than most people realize. The weirdest part is how many soldiers returned home, carrying pieces of the future in their pockets. Ballpoint pens that never leaked. Duct tape that fixed everything. Instant coffee that actually tasted decent. These guys had experienced tomorrow, while the rest of the world was still stuck in yesterday. Then there's the medical revolution, nobody talks about. Penicillin saved millions during the war, sure, but the real breakthrough was learning how to mass produce it. Before WWII, making medicine was basically arts and crafts. After the war, it became an assembly line. That shift from handmade to machine-made medicine changed everything about how we stay healthy. Consider the computer revolution. Most people think it started in Silicon Valley garages during the 1970s. Actually, it started in a secret British facility, where mathematicians were desperately trying to crack German codes. Colossus wasn't just the first computer, it was proof that machines could think faster than humans. The programmers working on it knew they were building the future, one electronic valve at a time. Let's not forget how the war changed the way we communicate. Before 1939, talking to someone far away meant shouting into a telephone attached to the wall. By 1945, soldiers were carrying walkie-talkies that worked across mountains. The jump from wired to wireless happened because military commanders got tired of having their communication lines cut by enemy forces. Well, radar deserves its own moment here. Britain's chain home system didn't just spot incoming bombers, it created the template for everything from air traffic control to weather forecasting. Every time you check if it's going to rain, you're using technology that once helped win the Battle of Britain. Makes sense, right? And the weird part is how many of these inventions almost didn't make it to civilian life. Jet engines were so secret that even some Allied commanders didn't know they existed. Synthetic materials, like nylon, were considered military secrets. Freeze-drying was classified technology. The public could have waited decades longer for these breakthroughs if not for smart business people who recognized gold when they saw it. Food science got completely revolutionized too. K-rations weren't just about feeding soldiers, they were about preserving nutrition in impossible conditions. The techniques developed for military rations became the foundation for everything from TV dinners to space food. Your microwave meal exists because someone figured out how to keep meat edible in a foxhole. Transportation took the biggest leap forward. The Jeep wasn't just a military vehicle, it was the prototype for every SUV that followed. Those amphibious duck trucks led to modern rescue vehicles. Even civilian cars started using bulletproof glass and reinforced frames based on military designs. But why did all this innovation happen so fast during wartime? Simple, when your survival depends on solving problems, you solve them quickly. Peacetime innovation moves at the speed of committees and budgets. Wartime innovation moves at the speed of life and death. The medical advances alone justify calling WWII the most innovative period in human history. Portable X-ray machines, blood plasma storage, synthetic drugs. These weren't just battlefield medicine, they became the foundation of modern healthcare. Every time you visit a hospital, you're surrounded by ideas that started in military field hospitals. Then there's the stuff that sounds too crazy to be true. Superglue was invented to fix airplane parts but ended up fixing everything else. The Slinky started as a battleship spring but became one of history's most popular toys. Duct tape was meant for ammunition boxes but became the universal repair tool. Here's what's really mind-blowing. Many of these innovations happened because ordinary people were thrown into extraordinary situations. A factory worker in Illinois invented duct tape. A naval engineer accidentally created the Slinky. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from the most unexpected places. World War II transformed ordinary people into inventors, soldiers into engineers, and desperate ideas into everyday miracles. The war ended in 1945, but its innovations keep changing our lives every single day.